the pond metaphor. Buddhist wisdom to calm overthinking, regulate your nervous system. Welcome, dear soul, to this sacred journey through the night. As you settle into comfort, allow your breathing to slow and deepen tonight. We travel together through ancient wisdom that has guided seekers for over 2,500 years. In the remote mountains where prayer flags flutter in the eternal wind, practitioners have discovered secrets that make the human spirit unbreakable, not through hardness but through flexibility, not through fighting but through flowing. Tonight, these timeless teachings will wash over you like a gentle stream, seeping into your consciousness as you rest. Let your eyes close softly. Feel your body sinking into complete relaxation. Your only task is to listen, to breathe, and to allow these ancient seeds of wisdom to plant themselves in the fertile soil of your peaceful mind. Principle 1. Words can never hurt you. Our first journey begins in the misty peaks of a sacred valley, where a secluded monastery clings to the cliffsides like jewels scattered across gray stone. In this sanctuary lived a young novice named Tenzin, whose life story teaches us the primary step toward becoming truly unshakable. This isn't merely a tale from long ago, it is a mirror reflecting your own inner strength, something you have always possessed but perhaps never fully recognized. Every morning, as the initial golden rays of sunlight pierced through the heavy mountain mist, Tenzin would wrap his simple robes around himself and begin the winding descent to the settlement below. His wooden alms bowl, smoothed by the touch of countless hands, rested gently in his palms as he walked the ancient path that generations of seekers had worn down with their steady footsteps. The air at this high altitude was thin and pure, carrying the clean scent of alpine pine and the distant rustle of flags moving in the endless wind. The village nestled in the green valley was home to simple, hard-working people, farmers who labored in terraced fields, herders who guided their livestock across high meadows, and shopkeepers who provided the daily necessities of rural life. Most of these residents held deep respect for the practitioners, understanding that these individuals had dedicated their existence to something beyond the ordinary, mundane concerns of daily life. They would bow their heads slightly when Tenzin passed, offering handfuls of rice, fresh vegetables, or warm tea with genuine kindness. But there was one man in this village whose heart had grown cold and hard with bitter disappointment. Kalen was a merchant who had once traveled far and wide, bringing exotic goods from distant lands to sell in these remote settlements. His shop had once been filled with vibrant fabrics, rare spices, and unique treasures that most villagers had only heard about in stories. However, a series of failed ventures, untrustworthy business partners, and simple bad luck had slowly drained away his wealth and, more tragically, his faith in the fundamental goodness of the world. Now Kalen's shop stood nearly empty, its wooden shelves holding only dust and painful memories. His family had long since moved to the larger trading hub down in the plains. Unable to bear the social shame of their reduced financial circumstances, he remained entirely alone, his mind poisoned by resentment that had fermented like wine left too long in a broken barrel. Every morning when young Tenzin passed after with his peaceful demeanor and gentle smile, something inside Kalen would twist with inexplicable rage. "Lazy beggar," Kalen would shout, his harsh voice echoing off the stone walls of the narrow street. "Worthless parasite, why don't you work like the rest of us instead of living off the kindness of others?" His words were sharp as mountain ice, specifically designed to cut, wound, and provoke. The other villagers would wince and quickly look away, embarrassed by the daily spectacle, but entirely unsure of how to intervene. But here is what made Tenzin truly remarkable, what made his response so incredibly powerful that it would eventually transform not just his own life, but the life of his tormentor and everyone who witnessed the daily drama. Tenzin never argued back. He never defended his choices or explained why Kalen was wrong. He never hurried past or took a different route to avoid the uncomfortable confrontation. Instead, he would pause, place his palms together at his chest in a gesture of respect, bow slightly toward the angry merchant, and continue on his way with the exact same serene expression he wore while meditating in the monastery's highest tower. The villagers simply could not comprehend it. How could someone absorb such toxic words day after day without it affecting their inner state? How could harsh insults that would have sent most people into a fury of rage or a puddle of tears seem to simply pass through Tenzin like wind through an open window? They began to gather at a respectful distance each morning, not out of cruel curiosity, but out of genuine wonder at witnessing something they instinctively recognized as truly profound. This daily routine continued for months. Through the brief mountain summer, when wild blossoms painted the hillsides in vibrant colors, through the golden autumn when the wind snapped fiercely through the valley, and into the harsh winter when heavy snow made the path treacherous and the thin air made each breath visible as a small white cloud. Still, every single morning brought the exact same ritual. Angry words hurled like heavy stones, and a peaceful acceptance that seemed to swallow those words without leaving a single trace. Then came the morning that would change everything forever. A small girl named Lynn, no more than 7 years old, had been watching this daily exchange from behind her grandmother's market stall. Children, with their natural wisdom and unfiltered curiosity, often perceive deep truths that adults completely miss. This particular morning, as Tenzin made his way back up the steep mountain path, little Lynn broke away from her grandmother and ran after him, her small legs working incredibly hard to keep up with his steady, unhurried pace. "Master Tenzin," she called out, her breath coming in small puffs in the freezing air, "please wait." The monk turned around, his face lighting up with the gentle smile he always reserved for children, a smile that seemed to contain all the warmth of summer sunshine. "What is it, little flower?" he asked kindly. "I have a question that keeps me awake at night," she said with that intense seriousness that only children can bring to truly important matters. "When that angry man says those mean things to you every single morning, why don't they hurt you? When other children say mean things to me at the market, my chest feels incredibly tight, and my eyes want to cry. But you always look so peaceful, like you're listening to beautiful music instead of ugly, hateful words." Tenzin's eyes crinkled with deep understanding. Here was a question that deserved far more than mere spoken words. It deserved a living demonstration that would plant a permanent seed of wisdom in this young, pure heart. He looked around the path and spotted a smooth, flat stone, worn perfectly round by countless seasons of mountain rain and wind. "Come with me, Lynn," he said gently, taking her small hand in his. "I want to show you something beautiful." He led her to the monastery's hidden meditation pond, a perfect circle of water that reflected the vast sky so clearly it seemed like an open window into heaven itself. The water was so incredibly still that every passing cloud, every bird that flew overhead, and every branch that swayed in the breeze was captured in perfect, immaculate detail on its surface. It was a mirror of such absolute clarity that visitors would often stand in silent amazement, feeling as if they were looking down into an entirely different world. "Watch very carefully, little one," Tenzin said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up the smooth gray stone so Lynn could see it clearly then. With a gentle underhand motion, he tossed it directly into the center of the still pond. The stone hit the water with a sharp splash that seemed to instantly shatter the perfect reflection into 1,000 dancing, chaotic pieces. Ripples spread outward in perfect concentric circles, each one growing larger and fainter as it traveled toward the pond's grassy edges. The beautiful reflection of the clouds and sky was completely gone, replaced by a constantly shifting pattern of light and shadow. For a moment, the peaceful mirror had become a chaos of erratic movement. Lynn watched with wide, captivated eyes as the ripples continued their journey across the water's surface. But then something magical began to happen. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, at first the ripples began to grow smaller. The wild motion began to settle down. The water started to remember its true, fundamental nature. And then, as if by miracle, the pond returned to a state of perfect, absolute stillness. The sky reappeared in its depths, clear and undisturbed. A single white cloud drifted across the reflected heavens, and a bird's shadow passed over the water like a silent blessing. It was as if the stone had never been thrown at all. "Do you see?" Tenzin asked, his voice warm with the joy of a teacher who knows his student is about to understand something beautiful. "The angry merchant's words are exactly like that stone. They hit the pond of my mind, and they do create initial ripples. I am human, after all, and harsh words do cause a temporary disturbance. But here is what I have learned through many years of consistent practice and many more years of making mistakes. He paused, allowing the child to lean closer, her face bright with curiosity. The ripples are not the pond. The disturbance is not who I am. Just as this water returns to stillness because that is its deepest, truest nature, my mind returns to peace because that is its deepest nature. The merchant's anger lives entirely in his heart, not in mine. His words can create temporary ripples on the surface, but they can never change what I truly am at my core. Little Lynn's eyes widened as the realization began to dawn upon her. So the mean words can't actually hurt you because you know they're just ripples. Her voice held that beautiful tone of wonder that comes when a profound truth clicks perfectly into place. Exactly, dear child. And here is the most beautiful part of all. When we don't hold on to the ripples, when we let them naturally fade away just as this pond did, our hearts remain completely open. We can even feel deep compassion for the person throwing the stones, because we understand that their anger comes entirely from their own pain, their own immense suffering. Tenzin knelt down so he was at Lynn's eye level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Think about Kalen, the merchant who shouts at me each morning. Do you think he was always this angry? Do you think he came into this world with hatred filling his heart? Lynn shook her head slowly, her natural intuition telling her that no human being is born with such bitterness. I remember when he first arrived in our valley, Tenzin continued softly. He was much younger then, full of vibrant dreams and endless energy. His shop was bright with beautiful colors and alive with the fascinating stories of his global travels. He would speak of distant lands with such genuine joy that children would gather just to listen to his voice. But disappointment after disappointment wore away at his hope, like wind and rain slowly wearing down a mountain peak. Now his internal pain is so great that it simply spills out onto anyone who reminds him of what he has lost. But why do you remind him of what has lost? Lynn asked, her young mind working hard to understand the complex machinery of human nature. Because when he sees me walking peacefully through the streets, completely content with simple robes and a wooden bowl, it reminds him of a time when he believed happiness came from having many material possessions. My internal contentment reflects his deep discontent, just as this still pond reflects the sky. He is not actually angry at me. Linny is angry at his own pain, his own lost dreams. Understanding this fundamental truth helps me respond to him with genuine compassion instead of defensiveness. The ancient sages taught that true peace comes entirely from within, do not seek it without. This wisdom was living proof before young Lin's eyes. Tenzin had found a peace so deep that nothing external could disturb it for long, not harsh words, not unfair treatment, not even daily doses of someone else's poison. But how do you make the ripples go away? Lin asked, her question cutting straight to the heart of practical wisdom. When someone says mean things to me, the hurt feeling stays inside my chest for a very long time. Tenzin smiled warmly, recognizing in this child's question the exact same struggle that every single human being faces throughout their life. The secret is not to fight the ripples or pretend they're not there. When harsh words hit your mind, you might feel hurt, anger, or sadness, and that is perfectly natural. The mistake is thinking that these temporary feelings define you, or that you must hold on to them tightly. He picked up another small stone from the ground and held it in his open palm. Watch again, he said, and gently tossed it into the pond. Again the ripples spread. Again the perfect reflection was temporarily disturbed now. Lin. What would happen if I jumped directly into the pond and tried to smooth out the ripples using my hands? Lin giggled at the funny image. You just make way more ripples. Exactly, fighting the ripples creates even more disturbance. But if I simply wait and trust completely in the water's true nature. They watched together in silence, as the pond once again returned to perfect, mirror-like stillness. This is exactly what meditation teaches us, Tenzin explained. We learn to observe our thoughts and feelings without being swept away by them. We learn to trust that our deepest nature, like this pond, is absolute peace. When someone throws stones, whether they are harsh words, unfair treatment, or heavy criticism, feel the initial splash, but we don't jump in and thrash around trying to fix it. We simply wait patiently for our natural peace to return. As they sat by the edge of the water, the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. warming their faces and sparkling beautifully on the pond's surface. Other monks had begun their daily activities around the sanctuary, some tending the vegetable gardens, others carefully copying sacred texts, and still others preparing for the day's spiritual teachings. The entire monastery hummed with a quiet, beautiful purpose, each person contributing to the collective whole while maintaining their individual practice of mindfulness. "Master Tenzin," Lin said quietly, "will you teach me how to be like the pond?" Her request was so incredibly sincere, so filled with a genuine desire to learn that it touched something deep in the monk's heart. Here was living proof that wisdom could be passed effortlessly from one generation to the next, that the teachings could take root in fresh, fertile soil. "The teaching has already begun, little flower," he replied warmly. "Every single time you remember this pond when someone speaks harshly to you, you are actively practicing. Every time you choose to let hurt feelings fade away naturally, instead of holding on to them tightly, you are growing stronger. Every time you look at an angry person and wonder what deep pain might be driving their behavior, you are developing genuine compassion." He stood up and gently brushed the dust from his robes. "But there is something else I want you to understand, Lin. This does not mean we become cold stones, feeling absolutely nothing. It does not mean we don't care when others are hurt, or that we accept cruelty without any response. The pond feels the stone's impact, it simply doesn't let that impact define its true nature." "What do you mean by that?" Lin asked, walking closely beside him as they headed back down toward the village. "Sometimes when someone is drowning in their own anger and pain, the kindest thing we can possibly do is remain completely calm and peaceful. Our stillness becomes a living reminder to them that peace is still possible in this world. Other times, true compassion might require us to speak up clearly, to set firm boundaries, or to take direct action to protect ourselves or others. The key is responding from a place of deep wisdom rather than reacting blindly from a place of hurt." As they approached the outskirts of the village, Lin suddenly stopped walking. "Master Tenzin, I want to try something new tomorrow morning. When you pass by Kalen's shop and he says those mean things, I'm going to imagine him as someone who is hurting deeply inside. I'm going to try to feel sorry for his pain instead of getting angry at his words." Tenzin's eyes sparkled with absolute delight. "Now you are thinking like a truly wise soul, little one. But remember, if you find it difficult at first, that is perfectly normal. Even experienced practitioners sometimes struggle with harsh treatment. The practice is not about being absolutely perfect. It is simply about returning to peace a little more quickly each time." The very next morning brought a profound surprise that no one in the village could have ever expected. As Tenzin made his usual journey down the ancient mountain path, and as Lin positioned herself behind her grandmother's market stall to watch the daily confrontation, something entirely different occurred. Kalen emerged from his shop as always, his face dark with its customary expression of bitter anger. But when he opened his mouth to hurl his usual sharp insults, he found himself looking directly into the eyes of a small girl who was watching him with an expression he had never seen before. Not fear, not judgment, but something that looked remarkably like deep understanding. The harsh words died instantly in his throat. For just a moment, the hardened merchant felt something crack in the thick armor of his bitterness. A 7-year-old child was looking at him with more genuine compassion than he had shown himself in years. Tenzin, noticing the subtle shift in energy, bowed slightly deeper than usual and continued on his way. But something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of that small village street. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged mountain peaks and painted the sky in magnificent shades of gold and crimson, Lin ran all the way up to the monastery to find Tenzin. She was completely breathless with excitement. "Master! Master! Something wonderful happened!" When I looked at Kalen this morning and tried to see his pain instead of his anger, I felt something change inside me. I wasn't scared of him at all anymore, and I think he felt it too. Tenzin nodded knowingly, his face full of peace. "This is the absolute power of the unshakable mind, Lin. When we truly understand that others' harsh words come entirely from their own internal suffering, we completely stop taking those words personally. When we stop taking them personally, we stop reacting with hurt or anger. And when we stop reacting, we create a beautiful space for something entirely new to happen: understanding, compassion, and even deep healing. The ancient ones taught that holding on to anger is exactly like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Young Lin had discovered this eternal truth not through scholarly study, but through the direct, lived experience of letting go. She had learned that the person who benefits most from forgiveness is not the one being forgiven, but the one doing the forgiving. In the days that followed, the daily confrontation between Kalen and Tenzin began to transform completely. The merchant's words became significantly less sharp, his voice losing its certainty. Sometimes he would emerge from his shop but remain entirely silent, simply watching as the peaceful monk passed by with his alms bowl. Other villagers began to notice the profound change, and whispers of hope began to replace the whispers of embarrassment. One beautiful morning, nearly a year after Lin had first asked her question by the meditation pond, Kalen did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. As Tenzin approached his shop, the merchant stepped forward, not with anger, but with an expression of deep uncertainty. "Monk," he said, his voice rough from disuse of kind words, "I have been incredibly unkind to you every single day for months, and you have never once responded to me with anger. Why?" Tenzin stopped walking and looked at Kalen with the exact same peaceful expression he had worn through all those months of insults. "Because your anger was never really about me," he said simply. "It was entirely about your pain. And pain, when it is understood with genuine compassion, eventually transforms into deep wisdom." Kalen's eyes instantly filled with hot tears, the first tears he had allowed himself to shed since his entire world had fallen apart years ago. "I've been so incredibly angry," he whispered, his voice trembling, "angry at the world, angry at life, angry at anyone who seemed to possess what I had lost. But mostly I've been angry at myself for failing so completely." "And now?" Tenzin asked gently. "Now I am so tired of being angry. I am tired of carrying this heavy poison inside my own consciousness. Can you teach me what you know? Can you show me how to find peace the way you have?" This is the miracle that occurs when we learn to be exactly like the pond, completely unshakable in our deepest nature, perfectly able to return to peace no matter what stones are thrown into our consciousness. We don't just protect ourselves from others' negativity, we create real possibilities for transformation that could never exist if we responded to anger with anger or hurt with hurt. The first principle of becoming unshakable is this: understand deeply that harsh words and cruel treatment say everything about the person giving them, and absolutely nothing about you. When someone tries to disturb your peace, they are simply broadcasting their own internal pain. You can choose to receive that broadcast and let it disturb your inner stillness, or you can let it pass completely through you like ripples on water, returning naturally to your true state of peace. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the peaceful image of that monastery pond. Remember that your deepest nature, like the water's deepest nature, is absolute stillness and peace. Tomorrow, when someone speaks harshly to you or treats you unfairly, you will have a choice. You can let their pain become your pain, or you can remain centered in your own peace and perhaps create a space for deep healing to occur. The ripples are not the pond. The disturbance is not who you are. Rest now in the knowledge that nothing can permanently disturb the peace that is your birthright. Principle 2. Everyone is your teacher. As our second journey unfolds, we travel from the high sanctuaries of the valley to the ancient, towering bamboo forests of a tranquil eastern province, where a completely different kind of wisdom awaited discovery. Here, in a time when scholars and poets walked dusty roads seeking true enlightenment, lived a master whose unique understanding of human nature would challenge everything we think we know about difficult people. His name was Master Ren, and the lesson he taught would transform anyone who truly grasps its profound simplicity. Picture a sanctuary unlike the stone fortress of the mountains. This monastery was built entirely of warm cedar wood and delicate paper screens, nestled deep within a massive grove of towering bamboo that whispered ancient secrets whenever the evening wind stirred their emerald leaves. The sound was like nature's own meditation, a soft, constant rustling that seemed to instantly wash away the chaotic noise of the busy world beyond the gates. Students came here from across the vast expanse of the land, some traveling for months along dangerous mountain passes and through perilous valleys, all seeking something that could never be found in books or bought with gold. Master Ren was known throughout the region not for stern discipline or harsh punishments, but for something far rarer: his infinite patience and his uncanny ability to see immense potential where others saw only problems. His eyes held the incredible depth of someone who had looked long and hard into the nature of human suffering and found not despair, but profound, unconditional compassion. Students would often say that a single conversation with Master Ren could instantly illuminate truths they had been searching for their entire lives. Among the many seekers who found their way to his wooden monastery was a young man named Jun, whose arrival would test every single ounce of Master Ren's legendary patience. Jun was brilliant. There was absolutely no denying that. His mind was sharp as a freshly forged blade, capable of cutting through complex philosophical arguments with startling, effortless precision. But somewhere in his 23 years of life, that brilliance had curdled into deep arrogance, and his sharp mind had become a weapon he used constantly to prove his absolute superiority over everyone around him. The other students noticed Jun's highly disruptive presence from his very first day in the community. During the pre-dawn meditation, when the entire monastery was supposed to be wrapped in profound, absolute silence, Jun would arrive exactly 7 minutes late, his wooden sandals clicking deliberately and loudly against the highly polished floors. He would settle onto his meditation cushion with an elaborate, noisy display of adjusting his silk robes, clearing his throat loudly, and shifting his position multiple times, movements specifically designed to draw attention to his arrival. The ripple of intense irritation that spread through the meditation hall was almost tangible, yet Master Ren never once turned his head or acknowledged the disruption in any way. During the daily teaching sessions, when Master Ren would share profound insights from ancient texts or speak beautifully about the nature of enlightenment, Jun would constantly interrupt with questions that weren't really questions at all, but thinly veiled attempts to demonstrate his own vast knowledge. "Master," he would say, his voice carrying just enough formal respect to avoid outright rudeness, "surely you're aware that the scholars of the classic dynasties interpreted that passage quite differently. Or, while that's an interesting perspective, don't you think it directly contradicts what the ancient texts taught about attachment?" These weren't the sincere, humble inquiries of a student seeking true understanding. They were intellectual traps designed to make Master Ren look foolish or unprepared. Yet, the master would respond to each challenge with genuine thoughtfulness, often saying, "What an excellent point, Jun. Let's explore that together," before launching into explanations that were somehow even deeper, more nuanced, and more beautiful than his original teaching. But it was Jun's behavior during the communal work periods that truly tested the community's patience to its absolute limit. Each student was assigned specific daily tasks: sweeping the meditation hall, tending the organic vegetable garden, preparing communal meals, or carefully copying ancient texts. These weren't considered chores. They were viewed as essential parts of spiritual practice, golden opportunities to cultivate mindfulness, presence, and humility. Jun, however, seemed to view manual labor as entirely beneath someone of his intellectual caliber. He would completely disappear during garden work, claiming later that he needed to contemplate a particularly challenging philosophical concept in solitude. When it was his turn to sweep the halls, he would do such a hasty, careless job that others had to completely redo his work. During meal preparation, he would position himself as far away as possible from the actual cooking, preferring to engage anyone who would listen in elaborate, high-minded discussions about the spiritual significance of different foods, rather than lifting a finger to help. The inevitable result was that the heavy burden of Jun's neglected duties fell directly on his fellow students, who were already working incredibly hard to maintain the monastery while pursuing their own spiritual development. They began to gather during their rare free time, their voices tight with intense frustration as they shared their grievances. "It's simply not fair," whispered Koi, an earnest young man who had given up a promising career as a government official to seek enlightenment. "We're all here to learn, but we end up doing his work on top of our own daily duties. How can we focus on our personal practice when we're constantly cleaning up after his irresponsibility and his constant showing off during the master's teachings? Added Hiro, an older student who had spent 3 years saving every coin for the long journey to the monastery. Has not trying to learn anything, has just trying to prove, has smarter than Master Ren. It's highly disrespectful, and it disrupts everyone's concentration. The complaints grew steadily louder and more frequent. Students who had come seeking deep peace found themselves consumed with bitter resentment toward their disruptive classmate. The harmonious atmosphere that Master Ren had carefully cultivated over decades was beginning to crack under the strain of one person's selfish behavior. Finally, on an evening when the bamboo grove was particularly restless in the wind, as if nature itself was perfectly reflecting the inner turmoil of the community, Hiro approached Master Ren. The master was sitting in his favorite spoda, small wooden platform, overlooking the monastery's lotus pond, where pink blossoms floated like prayers made visible. The setting sun painted everything in warm gold, but Hiro's face was dark with deep frustration. Master Hiro began, his usual calm demeanor cracking with suppressed emotion. We need to talk about Jun. His behavior is destroying the peace of our community. Hes disrespectful during meditation, highly disruptive during teachings, and completely lazy during work. The other students are talking about leaving the sanctuary if something doesn't change immediately. Master Ren nodded slowly, his calm eyes never leaving the lotus blossoms that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Tell me, Hiro, he said, his voice as calm as still water, what has Jun taught you? Hiro blinked in complete confusion. I don't understand, Master. What could I possibly learn from someone who shows absolutely no respect for our practice or our community? Master Ren smiled, not the gentle approving smile he usually wore, but something significantly deeper, tinged with a knowledge that seemed to encompass all of human nature's vast complexity. Come, he said, rising gracefully from his meditation cushion. Let me show you something. He led Hiro to the far edge of the monastery garden, where an ancient pine tree stood silhouetted against the darkening evening sky. This tree was famous throughout the entire region not for its conventional beauty, though it was indeed magnificent, but for its absolute resilience. For over 200 years it had endured violent mountain storms that had felled trees twice its physical size. Its trunk was gnarled, twisted, and bent by decades of harsh winds, yet it had grown incredibly strong and magnificent, its thick branches reaching toward heaven with unshakable determination. This tree, Master Ren said, running his weathered hand along the deeply grooved bark, do you think it curses the storms that have shaped its form? Does it resent the harsh winds that bent its trunk and stripped its needles away? Does it wish it had lived its life in a protected greenhouse, safe from all difficulties? Hiro stared at the ancient pine, beginning to sense that his teacher was leading him toward an understanding that would challenge everything he thought he knew about obstacles and difficulties. No, Master, he said slowly. The storms are what made it strong. Exactly, Master said, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of a teacher whose student was beginning to glimpse the ultimate truth. This tree didn't become magnificent despite the storms, it became magnificent precisely because of them. Each harsh wind that bent its branches forced it to sink its roots significantly deeper into the earth. Each brutal winter that stripped its needles taught it to conserve its inner energy and grow stronger from within. Every single challenge that could have destroyed it instead became an essential part of what made it beautiful. Hiro was beginning to understand the metaphor, but the radical implications of Master Ren's teaching were so intense that his mind naturally resisted them. But Master, he protested, surely, you're not saying that Jun's disruptive and selfish behavior is somehow good for us? Master Ren's eyes twinkled with something that looked remarkably like amusement. Tell me, Hiro, before Jun arrived at our monastery, how patient were you really? How deep was your actual compassion for difficult people? How strong was your commitment to your practice when conditions weren't perfectly convenient or comfortable? The questions hit Hiro like physical blows to the chest. He had always considered himself a patient, kind person, but he realized in this exact moment that his patience had never actually been tested. Living in the monastery before Jun's arrival had been pleasant, peaceful, and incredibly easy. Everyone was dedicated, respectful, and kind to one another. It is incredibly simple to be patient with people who never challenge your patience. Jun, Master Ren continued softly, is showing you exactly where your spiritual practice is still shallow. He is revealing the hidden places where your inner peace depends entirely on external conditions, rather than inner strength. He is teaching you the profound difference between conditional kindness and unconditional compassion. Hiro felt something shift deeply inside his chest, a sudden loosening of the tight, heavy knot of resentment he had carried for months. You're saying that my anger toward Jun is really about my own spiritual limitations. Him saying that Jun is holding up a mirror to this entire community, Master Rin replied. And what you see in that mirror, the impatience, the harsh judgment, the intense desire to control how others behave, these are the exact things that are blocking your path to true liberation. Without Jun, you might have spent years thinking you were far more advanced than you actually are. The ancient ones taught that when watching after yourself, you watch after others. And when watching after others, you watch after yourself. In this wisdom lay the key to understanding why every single person we encounter, especially the most difficult ones, are actually our teachers in disguise. But what about the practical problems? Hiro asked, his logical mind still struggling to integrate this new perspective. What about the disrupted meditations, the extra work, the disrespectful questions? How do we handle those tangible things if we're supposed to see Jun as a teacher? Master Ren nodded approvingly. Now you're asking the right question, Hiro. Seeing someone as a teacher doesn't mean becoming entirely passive or accepting harmful behavior. Without boundaries, it means responding to challenges with deep wisdom instead of reacting with blind emotion. He gestured toward the wooden buildings where warm light glowed from the windows. When Jun disrupts meditation, instead of feeling irritated, we can use it as a trigger to practice deeper concentration. When he asks challenging, arrogant questions instead of feeling defensive, I can use it as an opportunity to explore the teachings more deeply. When he completely avoids his work, instead of resenting him, we can practice true generosity of spirit by picking up his tasks without complaint. But doesn't that just enable his bad behavior? Hiro protested. Does the ancient pine tree enable the storm by bending with the wind instead of breaking? Master Ren asked. Sometimes the most powerful, transformative response to destructive behavior is to remain entirely centered and peaceful. Sometimes compassion requires setting firm boundaries. The key is acting from wisdom, rather than reacting from hurt emotion. As they walked back toward the monastery buildings, Hiro found himself seeing everything completely differently. The students he had previously viewed as victims of Jun's behavior now appeared to him as individuals being offered a profound opportunity for spiritual growth. The disruptions he had seen as obstacles to progress now looked like perfect training grounds for developing an absolutely unshakable peace. Master, Hiro said quietly, what about Jun himself? If we're all learning from him, what is he learning? Is he benefiting from his own behavior? Master Ren stopped walking and turned to face his student directly. Now you're beginning to see with true compassion, Hiro. Jun is the most isolated, lonely person in our entire community. His arrogance is a thick wall he has built to protect a fragile heart that is terrified of being found inadequate. His disruptions are desperate attempts to feel important, to matter to the world. He's teaching you patience and compassion. Yes, but what he's learning is much, much harder. What is he learning? He's learning that no amount of intellectual brilliance can ever substitute for genuine human connection. He's learning that trying to prove your worth through superiority only leads to absolute loneliness. Most importantly, he's learning, though he doesn't recognize it yet, what it feels like to be met with infinite patience and kindness, even when you don't deserve it. Hiro felt tears gathering in his eyes as he understood the full, magnificent scope of what Master Rin was revealing. You've been teaching him too, haven't you? All those times when you responded to his disrespect with patience, when you answered his trap questions with genuine wisdom, you were showing him what unconditional compassion looks like. Every single interaction is a teaching, Master Ren said simply. When we respond to difficulty with wisdom instead of reactivity, we plant seeds. We may never see those seeds sprout in our lifetime, but that doesn't make the planting less important. In the days that followed Hiro's conversation with Master Ren, something truly remarkable began to happen within the monastery. As Hiro shared the master's profound teaching with the other students, their entire relationship with Jun began to transform completely. Instead of seeing him as a frustrating obstacle to their spiritual progress, they began to view him as an essential part of it. When Jun arrived late to meditation, instead of feeling irritated, the students used his noisy disruption as a reminder to sink significantly deeper into their own concentration. When he asked his challenging questions during teachings, instead of viewing them as disrespectful interruptions, they listened carefully to Master Ren's responses, learning not just about philosophy, but about how to handle difficult people with grace. Most remarkably, when Jun avoided his work duties, the other students began volunteering to take on the extra tasks, not with resentment, but with genuine compassion for someone who was clearly struggling with his own inner conflicts. They began to see laziness not as selfishness, but as a symptom of someone who had never learned the joy of serving others. This profound shift in perspective had an entirely unexpected effect on Jun himself. For months, he had been feeding off the irritation and resentment of his fellow students. Their negative reactions had confirmed his deep belief that he was superior to them, that their spiritual practice was shallow and easily disturbed. But as their responses changed to calm compassion, the energy that fueled his disruptive behavior began to dissipate completely. It is incredibly difficult to maintain arrogance when everyone around you responds to your worst behavior with unconditional compassion. It's hard to feel superior when people meet your selfishness with absolute generosity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jun's rigid defenses began to crack. The ultimate breakthrough came on a beautiful spring morning, when the bamboo grove was alive with new growth. Jun had once again failed to show up for his assigned garden work, leaving the others to weed the vegetable plots alone. But this time, instead of grumbling about his absence, the students worked in peaceful silence, completely grateful for the opportunity to practice mindfulness while their hands moved among the growing plants. Jun, who had been hiding in the monastery library, ostensibly studying but actually avoiding work, happened to look out the window and see his fellow students bent over the garden beds. For the very first time, he really saw them not as people he needed to impress or outsmart, but as human beings who were quietly carrying his burden without a single complaint. Something inside him broke wide open. All his life he had believed that worth came from being better than others, smarter than others, more important than others. But watching those students tend the garden with such peace and dedication, he realized he had never felt the simple satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. Without saying a single word, Jun closed his book and walked outside. He knelt directly beside Koei, picked up a weeding tool, and began working. The other students glanced up in surprise, but they didn't make a big show of welcoming him. They simply made room for him in the row of vegetables. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, Jun worked without trying to prove anything to anyone. He just worked, pulling weeds, loosening soil, his hands growing dirty alongside everyone else's. And in that simple shared labor, he discovered something he had been seeking his entire life without knowing it. The beautiful feeling of belonging. That evening, Master Ren found Jun sitting entirely alone by the lotus pond, staring intently at his reflection in the still water. Master Jun said without looking up, "I think I understand now why you never asked me to leave, even when everyone wanted you to." Oh, Master Ren settled gently beside him, on the wooden platform. "What do you understand, Jun? You saw what I couldn't see, that I needed to learn how to be a part of something instead of apart from everything. You knew that the other students needed to learn how to love someone who was incredibly hard to love. We were all each other's teachers." Master Ren smiled the deep, satisfied smile of a gardener whose careful tending has finally produced fruit. And what was the most important lesson? Jun was quiet for a long moment, watching the lotus blossoms bob gently in the evening breeze. "That everyone I meet is showing me something about myself. The people who irritate me are showing me where I still need to grow. The people who challenge me are strengthening my compassion. Even the people who seem to have nothing to teach me are teaching me about true humility. This profound understanding is exactly what the ancient sages meant when they taught that we are all interconnected, that every encounter is a golden opportunity for mutual awakening. The principle that everyone is your teacher doesn't just apply to wise masters or enlightened beings. It applies most especially to the difficult people, the ones who trigger our impatience, our judgment, our intense desire to control. In our modern world, this ancient wisdom is more relevant than ever before. That coworker who constantly interrupts meetings is teaching you about patience and the art of listening. That family member who always has to be right is showing you how to respond with love instead of arguing. That stranger who cuts you off in traffic is offering you a chance to practice letting go of anger instantly. The key is shifting your perspective from, "Why is this person making my life difficult?" to, "What is this person here to teach me?" This single change in viewpoint transforms every challenging interaction from a source of immense stress into a powerful opportunity for personal growth. When someone criticizes you unfairly, instead of getting defensive, you can ask, "Is this teaching me about my attachment to others' opinions?" When someone treats you rudely, instead of taking it personally, you can wonder, "Is this showing me how pain sometimes expresses itself as aggression?" This doesn't mean accepting abuse or failing to set appropriate boundaries. Like the pine tree that bends with the storm but doesn't break, we can be flexible and responsive without being passive victims. Sometimes the teaching requires us to speak up clearly, to protect ourselves, or to walk away. But we can do these things from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity, from strength rather than weakness. The beautiful paradox of seeing everyone as your teacher is that it makes you virtually unshakable. When difficult people are no longer enemies to be defeated, but teachers to be learned from, they completely lose their power to disturb your peace. When challenging situations become opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to happiness, you discover an inner resilience that nothing can destroy. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, carry with you the image of that ancient pine tree shaped by storms into something magnificent. Remember that every person who challenges you is offering you the exact chance you need to sink deeper roots, to grow stronger, to become more beautiful in your response to life's difficulties. Tomorrow, when you encounter someone who tests your patience, you will have a choice. You can see them as an enemy of your peace, or as a teacher offering you the exact lesson you need for your growth. In that choice lies the profound difference between remaining reactive and becoming truly wise, between staying fragile and becoming unshakable. Principle 3. Transform envy into inspiration. From the bamboo groves of the sanctuary, our journey now carries us to the bustling marketplaces of an ancient desert trading city, where the very foundations of spiritual wisdom were tested daily here. Beneath the scorching sun and among the loud calls of merchants hawking their wares, we discover a truth so powerful it can transform one of humanity's most destructive emotions into a force for profound personal growth. This is the story of two seekers whose different responses to the same situation would reveal the third principle of becoming unshakable. In the great trading city of Okavan, where caravans from distant lands converged to exchange rich silk, exotic spices, and precious gems, stood a modest sanctuary that served as a refuge for wandering practitioners. The monastery was simple, just a collection of small mud brick huts surrounding a central courtyard where a single massive acacia tree provided blessed shade from the relentless sun. Unlike the remote mountain retreats, this sanctuary existed in the very heart of human activity, where the spiritual and material worlds collided daily in a constant symphony of commerce, ambition, and desire. Two young novices, Kale and Ananda, had arrived at this sanctuary on the exact same dusty road, both seeking to deepen their understanding of life's deeper truths. They were incredibly similar in many ways, both highly intelligent, both deeply dedicated to their practice, both having left comfortable family lives to pursue a higher path. Yet, their responses to the world around them would prove to be as entirely different as fire and water. Kale was a serious young man whose intense dark eyes reflected his earnest dedication to spiritual principles. He had memorized vast portions of the classic texts and could recite complex philosophical arguments with a precision that impressed even the sanctuary's elder guides. His meditation practice was disciplined and rigorous. He would sit completely motionless for hours, his back straight as a mountain peak, his breathing so controlled it barely stirred the dust around him. Yet, for all his intense dedication, there was something incredibly rigid about Kale's approach, something that suggested he viewed spiritual progress as a competition to be won rather than a journey to be experienced. Ananda, by contrast, approached his practice with a beautiful lightness that some mistook for a lack of seriousness. He laughed easily, asked questions that revealed a genuine curiosity rather than a desire to impress others, and seemed to find immense wonder in the simplest aspects of community life. When he meditated, his face always held a gentle smile, as if he were visiting with an old friend. When he studied the texts, he would often pause to gaze out the window, apparently lost in contemplation of how the teachings applied directly to the bustling life beyond the monastery walls. The monastery's location in the heart of Oakhaven meant that the seekers regularly encountered the full spectrum of human fortune and misfortune. Wealthy merchants would arrive at the sanctuary's gates in elaborate carriages, seeking blessings for their business ventures or offering generous donations in gratitude for successful trades. Their silk robes rustled with every movement. Their fingers glittered with rings worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, and their confident bearing spoke of lives lived entirely without material worry. It was the arrival of one such merchant that would test both seekers in ways they never anticipated. His name was Zephyr, and even by the high standards of Oakhaven's wealthy traders, he was extraordinarily successful. His caravan stretched for nearly a quarter-mile along the dusty road, dozens of camels loaded with precious goods, guards on horseback with gleaming armor, and servants attending to every conceivable need. Zephyr himself rode in a carriage so ornate it seemed to capture and reflect the desert sunlight like a moving jewel. When Zephyr approached the sanctuary to make his customary donation, the contrast between his worldly magnificence and the seeker's simple robes was almost overwhelming. He stepped from his carriage wearing robes of the finest woven silk, dyed in colors so rich they seemed to glow, deep purples harvested from distant seas, golds that rivaled the sun itself, and blues that captured the absolute depth of twilight skies. Precious stones adorned his fingers, neck, and wrists, each one carefully chosen according to ancient traditions. But it wasn't just Zephyr's wealth that commanded attention, it was his profound presence. He moved with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world, who had turned every single challenge into an opportunity, every risk into a magnificent reward. When he spoke, his voice carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Yet there was nothing arrogant about his demeanor. Instead, he radiated the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his true purpose and pursued it with complete, unswerving dedication. As Zephyr described his recent travels to the sanctuary's elders, both Kale and Ananda find themselves completely drawn into his stories. He spoke of negotiating with rulers in mountain kingdoms where the air was so thin that every breath felt precious. He described crossing vast, trackless deserts where the stars were so brilliant they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. He told of discovering entirely new trade routes that would bring immense prosperity to entire regions, of building relationships with families who had been conducting business across those routes for generations. "Next month," Zephyr said, his eyes sparkling with anticipation, "I leave for the eastern archipelago beyond the vast sea. It's a journey that will take 2 full years. But the rewards, both material and spiritual, will be extraordinary. I'll be able to fund 3 new sanctuaries and provide for 100 families through the employment my ventures create." As Zephyr spoke, he reached into a silk pouch and withdrew a handful of heavy gold coins, each one stamped with the seal of a different kingdom. He placed them gently in the sanctuary's donation bowl, the precious metal ringing softly against the simple clay. "For the community," he said with a slight bow. "May these humble offerings support your noble work." After Zephyr departed in his magnificent caravan, leaving behind only the settling dust and the lingering scent of exotic incense that had clung to his robes, the monastery seemed suddenly smaller, plainer, almost shabby by comparison. The seekers' simple robes felt rougher against their skin. Their basic meals seemed more meager. Their modest sleeping quarters appeared cramped and uncomfortable. For Kale, the encounter with Zephyr was like a poisoned arrow shot straight into his heart. As he lay on his thin sleeping mat that night, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling of his tiny cell, his mind churned with bitter thoughts that he could not quiet, no matter how hard he tried to focus on his breath. It's simply not fair, he thought, his jaw clenched tightly with suppressed resentment. I've given up absolutely everything to pursue this path: my family's wealth, my comfortable life, my promising future as a scholar. I spend my days in meditation and study, trying to purify my mind and serve others. Yet this merchant, who spends his entire existence accumulating possessions and pursuing profit, lives like a king while I sleep on the bare ground. The more Kale thought about the stark contrast between his austere life and Zephyr's opulent existence, the more deeply agitated he became. During morning meditation, instead of focusing on his breath, he found himself vividly imagining what it would feel like to wear fine silk robes, to travel in a comfortable carriage, to command the absolute respect that wealth brings. When he tried to study the texts, the words seemed to mock him with their teachings about the illusory nature of material possessions. If possessions are really meaningless, Kale caught himself thinking, then why do I feel so incredibly empty without them? If spiritual practice is supposed to bring happiness, why do I feel more miserable than before I entered the sanctuary? These thoughts terrified Kale because they directly contradicted everything he believed about his spiritual path. He had always prided himself on his detachment from worldly concerns, his ability to find complete contentment in simplicity. But Zephyr's visit had revealed that his detachment was shallow, that his contentment depended entirely on not being confronted with attractive alternatives. Day by day, Kale's envy grew like a thorny vine, wrapping itself tightly around his peace and choking out his joy. He became highly irritable with his fellow seekers, deeply critical of the monastery's simple conditions, and resentful toward anyone who seemed happier than he felt. His meditation practice, once a source of deep satisfaction, became a constant struggle against intrusive thoughts about wealth, comfort, and status. His study of the texts became an exercise in finding reasons why worldly success was spiritually meaningless, a defensive strategy rather than genuine learning. Ananda, witnessing his friend's painful transformation, felt deep compassion for Kale's suffering. But Ananda's own response to Zephyr's visit had been completely different, and this difference would prove to be the key to understanding how envy can be transformed into inspiration. When Ananda first saw Zephyr's magnificent caravan, he felt the exact same initial stirring of admiration, and perhaps a touch of longing that any human being might experience when confronted with such prosperity. But instead of allowing these natural feelings to ferment into bitter resentment, Ananda examined them with the gentle curiosity that characterized his approach to all mental phenomena. How interesting, he thought to himself as he watched Zephyr's carriage disappear down the dusty road, him feeling a strong attraction to his lifestyle. What exactly is it that I'm admiring so much? Is it the wealth itself, or is it something significantly deeper? As Ananda reflected deeply on this question over the following days, he began to realize that what he truly admired about Zephyr wasn't the merchant's material possessions, but his incredible qualities of character. Zephyr had displayed remarkable discipline, kind of focused dedication, that had allowed him to build a vast trading empire from humble beginnings. He had shown immense courage in his willingness to undertake dangerous journeys to unknown, hazardous lands. He had demonstrated deep wisdom in his ability to navigate complex negotiations and build strong relationships across cultural boundaries. Most importantly, Zephyr had exhibited profound generosity, not just in his donation to the sanctuary, but in his apparent commitment to using his wealth to benefit others. His mention of funding new sanctuaries and providing stable employment showed that his pursuit of prosperity wasn't purely selfish, but included a genuine desire to contribute to the welfare of his community. These are exactly the qualities I want to develop in my own spiritual practice, Ananda realized with excitement. Discipline, courage, wisdom, and generosity. Zephyr may be pursuing these virtues through commerce while I pursue them through meditation and study. but the underlying virtues are exactly the same. This single insight transformed Ananda's entire relationship with his own practice. Instead of seeing Zephyr as someone who had chosen worldly success over spiritual development, Ananda began to see him as someone who was actively developing spiritual qualities through worldly means. This perspective didn't make Ananda want to abandon his simple life, but it did inspire him to approach his practice with completely renewed energy and purpose. If Zephyr could show such unwavering discipline in building his business, Ananda reasoned, then surely he could bring that exact same level of dedication to his daily meditation practice. If Zephyr could be so courageous in facing the physical dangers of long-distance trade, then Ananda could be equally brave in confronting the difficult emotions and insights that arose during deep psychological practice. If Zephyr could demonstrate such wisdom in his commercial dealings, then Ananda could apply himself more diligently to understanding the profound truths of the texts. Most transformatively, if Zephyr could be so generous with his material wealth, then Ananda could find ways to be equally generous with his spiritual wealth-sharing insights with fellow seekers, offering deep compassion to struggling practitioners, and radiating peace to everyone he encountered. The change in Ananda was instantly visible to everyone in the monastery. His meditation became significantly deeper and more focused, inspired by Zephyr's example of unwavering concentration on long-term goals. His study of the text became more thorough and insightful, motivated by Zephyr's demonstration of how careful preparation leads to ultimate success. His interactions with others became more patient, kind, and encouraging, reflecting Zephyr's skill in building positive, lasting relationships. Within weeks, other seekers began seeking out Ananda for guidance and support. His happiness seemed to be highly contagious, his insights more profound, and his presence more calming. Paradoxically, by allowing himself to be inspired by a wealthy merchant's worldly success, Ananda had become a significantly more successful spiritual practitioner. The stark contrast between the two seekers' responses to the exact same situation illustrates a profound teaching about the nature of human suffering and happiness. The wise ones taught, "Do not be jealous of others' good qualities, but out of admiration, adopt them yourself." This simple instruction contains the absolute key to transforming one of our most painful emotions into one of our most powerful tools for personal growth. Envy inevitably arises when we focus entirely on what others have that we lack: their possessions, their success, their relationships, or their apparent happiness. This narrow focus creates a deep, painful sense of scarcity, a feeling that there isn't enough good fortune to go around, that someone else's gain somehow diminishes our own possibilities in life. Envy makes us smaller, more bitter, and intensely focused on what's missing from our lives rather than what's present. But when we shift our attention from what others have to how they got it from their external circumstances to their internal qualities, envy transforms instantly into powerful inspiration. Instead of feeling diminished by others' success, we feel deeply motivated to develop the exact same virtues that led to their achievements. Instead of seeing their good fortune as evidence of life's unfairness, we see it as proof of what becomes possible when certain qualities are consistently cultivated and applied. This profound transformation requires a fundamental shift in how we understand success and happiness. Most envy is based on the false assumption that external circumstances determine internal. States people are happy because they are wealthy, loved because they are attractive, or fulfilled because they are famous. But wisdom teaches the exact opposite: that internal qualities create external circumstances, that true happiness comes from within, and then naturally attracts favorable conditions. When we fully understand this principle, every single person we envy becomes a teacher showing us exactly which qualities we need to develop within ourselves. The colleague who gets promoted reveals the absolute importance of dedication and skill. The friend in a happy relationship demonstrates the immense value of compassion and open communication. The neighbor with a beautiful estate shows us what patience and consistent effort can accomplish over time. Several months after his initial visit, Zephyr returned to Oakhaven. His eastern journey had been even more remarkably successful than anticipated, and his massive caravan was now loaded with rare spices, fine silks, and treasures from distant islands. But more than his material wealth, what struck the seekers was the noticeable change in Zephyr himself. He seemed significantly more peaceful, more deeply wise, and more content than ever before. During his visit to the sanctuary, Zephyr shared stories of the immense challenges he had faced. During his sea voyage, violent storms that had tested his courage to the limit, complex negotiations that had required all his patience and wisdom, and dark moments of doubt when only his discipline had carried him forward. Every single difficulty became a teacher, he said softly to the elders. Every obstacle became a golden opportunity to grow stronger from within. As Kale listened to these words, something shifted deeply inside his consciousness. He suddenly realized that Zephyr's success hadn't come from mere luck or privilege, but from the exact same qualities that spiritual practices emphasized: courage, patience, wisdom, and perseverance. The merchant had been following a high path all along, just not in the way Kale had expected. For the first time in months, Kale felt his bitter envy begin to dissolve completely. In its place arose a beautiful new appreciation for his own path, and a genuine deep admiration for Zephyr's journey. He began to see clearly that there are many ways to cultivate virtue, many paths to wisdom, and many opportunities for growth, and that comparing his unique path to others had been blocking him from fully embracing his own development. Ananda, watching his friend's transformation with joy, approached Kale after Zephyr's departure. "What changed inside you, my friend?" he asked gently. "I finally understood what you saw from the very beginning," Kale replied, a peaceful expression returning to his face. "I was so incredibly focused on what Zephyr had that I completely failed to see who he was. His material wealth was just the external result of internal qualities, the exact same qualities we're trying to develop through our practice here. Instead of being envious of his success, I should have been inspired by his example from the start. And now," Ananda asked with a smile, "now I want to develop that exact same level of discipline in my daily meditation, that same courage in facing difficult truths within myself, and that same wisdom in understanding life. Zephyr showed me what is possible when these qualities are fully developed. He became my teacher without even knowing it." This story illustrates a truth that can transform every single moment of envy into a powerful opportunity for personal growth. In our modern world, we are constantly exposed to others who seem to have significantly more than we do: more success, more happiness, more love, or more recognition. Digital connections have made this exposure constant and unavoidable, creating endless opportunities for painful comparison and envy. But each of these moments is also a golden opportunity to practice the wisdom Ananda discovered. When you see someone's success, instead of focusing on what they possess, ask yourself honestly what qualities they must have developed to achieve it. When a colleague gets a promotion you deeply wanted, instead of feeling bitter, consider what skills or attitudes they demonstrated that you could cultivate within yourself. When a friend seems happier than you, instead of resenting their joy, observe carefully how they approach life, challenges, and relationships. This consistent practice transforms envy from a corrosive poison that destroys your peace into a precise compass that points directly toward your own personal growth. Every person you envy becomes a mirror showing you your own hidden potential. Every achievement that stirs your jealousy becomes a map showing you exactly which qualities to develop. The key is remembering that qualities of character, courage, discipline, wisdom, compassion, and generosity are not limited resources. One person's development of these virtues never diminishes your ability to develop them too. In fact, seeing these qualities expressed successfully in others proves that they are attainable, that the path of growth you are on leads somewhere real, valuable, and tangible. There is a beautiful paradox in this practice. The more you transform envy into inspiration, the less you ever need external validation to feel successful. When you are completely focused on developing your own character, rather than comparing your external circumstances to others, you find a deep, lasting satisfaction in your growth, regardless of how it measures against others' achievements. You become truly unshakable, because your sense of worth comes entirely from within, rather than from comparison. This doesn't mean becoming complacent or losing your drive. Ananda didn't lose his motivation to grow when he stopped envying Zephyr. Instead, He became more motivated than ever, but his motivation came from pure inspiration rather than inadequacy, from a love of excellence rather than a fear of being left behind. As you rest tonight, bring to mind someone whose success has recently stirred feelings of envy or inadequacy in you. Instead of focusing on what they have that you lack, consider deeply what qualities they must possess to have achieved what they've achieved. Ask yourself, how can I develop these same qualities in my own life, in my own unique way? Perhaps their success required exceptional dedication. How can you bring that same level of commitment to your own personal goals? Maybe they showed remarkable courage where in your life. Could you benefit from being braver? Possibly they demonstrated great compassion. How might you express more kindness in your daily interactions? When you wake tomorrow, you will have a clear choice in how you respond to others' success. You can let their achievements make you feel smaller, or you can let them inspire you to become larger. You can use their good fortune as evidence that life is unfair, or as proof of what becomes possible when virtue is cultivated and applied. The third principle of becoming unshakable is this: transform every single moment of envy into an opportunity for inspiration. See in others' successes not a reason for resentment, but a roadmap for your own development. Let their achievements light the way toward your own growth, rather than casting shadows on your self-worth. In this transformation lies one of the most liberating discoveries of the life journey, that everyone you meet is either a teacher showing you something to cultivate, or a mirror reflecting something you've already developed. Either way, every encounter becomes an opportunity for learning, every comparison becomes a tool for growth, and every feeling of envy becomes a doorway to inspiration. In this way, you become truly unshakable not because you never feel envy, but because you've learned to alchemize that feeling into pure gold. Principle 4. Be strict with yourself, gentle with others. Our journey through ancient wisdom now leads us to the misty, forested mountains of a peaceful northern peninsula, where autumn painted the rolling hillsides in brilliant flames of red and gold. Here, in a monastery perched like an eagle's nest on a high cliff overlooking valleys thick with ancient forests, we encounter a teaching so profound yet so simple that it would completely revolutionize how we see both our own shortcomings and the failings of others. This is the story of a wise guide named Master Heyman and two students whose opposing approaches to self-discipline and compassion would illuminate the fourth principle of unshakable inner strength. The sanctuary of eternal springs had earned its name from the natural hot springs that bubbled up from deep within the mountain, providing warmth and comfort even during the harshest winters. Heavy steam would rise from these sacred pools like incense offerings to the sky, creating an atmosphere of perpetual mystery, peace, and renewal. The monastery itself was built in a traditional style, with gracefully curved timber rooftops that seemed to dance with the mountain mists and wooden buildings that had weathered centuries of seasons while maintaining their quiet, dignified strength. Master Heyman, the monastery's gentle yet formidable teacher, was known throughout the land for his highly unusual approach to spiritual instruction. While many masters of his era were stern, demanding, and quick to punish, Master Heyman had developed a rare reputation for seeing directly into the heart of each student's unique struggles and offering precisely the guidance they needed to overcome their particular obstacles. His eyes, deep-set and kind, seemed to hold both infinite patience and unwavering discernment, as if he could see not just who you were in the present moment, but who you were fully capable of becoming. Among his many students were two young novices whose contrasting personalities would provide the perfect laboratory for exploring the delicate balance between self-discipline and compassion. The first was Quan, a perfectionist whose dedication to practice was matched only by his harsh judgment of anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards. The second was Minsu, whose incredibly kind heart and gentle nature masked a troubling tendency towards severe self-criticism and personal laxity. Quan had arrived at the monastery with the intense energy of someone fleeing from his own imperfections. As the eldest son of a wealthy merchant family, he had been intensely groomed for success from early childhood, taught that absolute excellence was not just expected, but mandatory. Every single aspect of his upbringing had reinforced the deep belief that worth was earned entirely through achievement, that love was conditional upon performance, and that any failing was a cause for deep shame. When he decided to enter the sanctuary, Quan brought this same merciless drive for perfection to his practice, but with a twist that made his presence incredibly difficult for everyone around him. Quan held himself to impossibly high standards, rising long before dawn to meditate for hours, memorizing vast passages of classic texts with machinalistic precision, and performing every single monastery duty with meticulous attention to detail. His own cell was completely immaculate, his few possessions arranged with geometric precision, his sleeping mat positioned at exactly the correct angle, and his water bowl polished to a mirror brightness. He fasted regularly, often skipping meals to demonstrate his complete detachment from bodily desires, and he could sit in meditation for longer periods than practitioners with decades more experience. But Quan's perfectionism came with a terrible hidden cost. He applied the exact same ruthless standards to everyone around him. When a fellow student arrived just a few minutes late to morning meditation, Quan's disapproving glare could be felt across the entire hall. If someone made a minor error while reciting texts, Quan would correct them instantly with barely concealed irritation. When monastery duties weren't performed to his exacting specifications, he would redo the work himself, making sure others noticed his superior efforts. How can they be so incredibly careless with their practice? Quan would mutter to himself as he swept floors that others had already cleaned, his jaw tight with frustration. Don't they understand that every single moment wasted, every duty performed carelessly, and every distraction entertained is a major obstacle to growth? If they can't even fold their robes properly, how can they hope to achieve true wisdom? The other students naturally began to avoid Quanah out of malice, but out of sheer exhaustion. His constant criticism and implied superiority created an atmosphere of intense tension that seemed to defeat the very purpose of a supportive community. Even his genuine achievements, his profound knowledge of the texts, his impressive meditation skills, and his unquestionable dedication were completely overshadowed by the uncomfortable feeling that he was keeping score of everyone's progress and finding them all severely lacking. Minsu represented the exact opposite extreme. Where Quan was incredibly harsh with others, Minsu was endlessly patient, understanding, and forgiving. He had been raised by grandparents whose unconditional love had taught him to see the absolute best in everyone, to make excuses for others' failings, and to offer second, third, and fourth chances to anyone who disappointed him. His natural compassion made him deeply beloved by everyone in the monastery. Students sought him out for comfort when they struggled, and even the most difficult personalities seemed to soften instantly in his presence. But Mince's gentleness with others was matched by a troubling hidden harshness toward himself. When he made minor mistakes, arriving late, forgetting a specific teaching, or performing a task imperfectly, would berate himself with a psychological cruelty that would have shocked anyone who knew only his public kindness. "You're so incredibly stupid," he would whisper to himself after stumbling over a passage during group recitation. "Everyone else can remember these teachings easily, but you can't even pay attention properly. You don't deserve to be here with these dedicated practitioners." While Quan drove himself to excessive achievement through force, Mince's severe self-criticism often paralyzed him into complete inaction. He would spend so much mental energy berating himself for previous mistakes that he could not focus on present tasks. His meditation practice suffered because he was constantly distracted by thoughts of how inadequate his concentration was. His study of the texts was hampered by a loud voice in his head that insisted he was far too simple-minded to understand profound teachings. The irony was that both novices were sabotaging their progress, just in opposite ways. Quan's constant criticism of others created massive barriers to the compassion that is central to a peaceful life. Mince's severe self-criticism created massive barriers to the self-respect and confidence necessary for genuine growth. Both were stuck in rigid patterns that seemed virtuous on the surface, but were actually major obstacles to enlightenment. Master Haemon observed both students with the patient attention of a skilled gardener, watching seedlings struggle toward the light. He could see clearly that each possessed exactly what the other needed. Quan had the self-discipline that Minsu lacked, while Minsu had the compassion that Quan needed to develop. But simply telling them to change would be entirely useless. They needed to discover this truth through their own lived experience. The perfect opportunity for this discovery came during the monastery's annual preparation for winter. Each autumn, the entire community would work together to gather firewood, preserve food, repair wooden buildings, and complete all the heavy tasks necessary to survive the harsh mountain winter. It was a unique time when individual practice merged with collective responsibility, when the monastery's survival depended entirely on everyone contributing their best efforts. Master Heyman assigned Quan and Minsu to work together on the crucial task of waterproofing the main meditation hall's timber roof. This job required both technical precision. The tiles had to be positioned exactly right to prevent leaks and patient cooperation, since two people had to coordinate their movements while balancing on steep, slippery surfaces high above the ground. From the very first morning of their collaboration, the fundamental difference in their approaches became glaringly apparent. Quan approached the task with his characteristic intensity, carefully measuring each tile placement, checking and rechecking every joint, and working with the focused determination of someone for whom anything less than perfection was unacceptable. When Minsu made small errors, placing a tile slightly askew, letting his attention wander for a moment, or working at a pace that Quan considered insufficiently urgent, Quan's frustration became increasingly obvious. No, Quan would say, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation, as he aggressively repositioned tiles that Minsu had just placed. The measurements have to be completely exact, or the whole section will leak when the snow comes. If we're going to do this job, we need to do it right the first time. His criticism was technically accurate, but delivered with an edge that made Minsu wince and become even more nervous, which led to more mistakes, which increased Quan's frustration in a painful cycle that seemed destined to explode. Meanwhile, Minsu's internal dialogue was becoming increasingly vicious. "You're ruining everything," he told himself after each correction from Quan. "You can't even place simple roof tiles properly. How pathetic is that?" Quan probably thinks, "You're the most incompetent person he's ever worked with. You should just quit right now and let someone capable handle this important work." But instead of quitting or defending himself, Minsu did something that revealed the beautiful but misguided nature of his character. When Quan made his own mistakes, dropping tools, miscalculating measurements, or struggling with the physical demands of the heavy work, Minsu immediately offered warm understanding and support. "Don't worry about it at all," Quan Minsu would say gently when Quan fumbled a heavy tile and sent it sliding off the roof. "This is difficult work and we're both learning. Let me help you with that heavy section over there." This pattern continued for 3 full days. Quan was incredibly harsh with Minsu's errors, but entirely blind to his own. Minsu was gentle with Quan's struggles, but merciless toward his own failings. The roof work progressed slowly, hampered not by a lack of physical skill, but by the negative emotional atmosphere the two novices had created. Other students began to notice the heavy tension and started avoiding the area where Quan and Minsu were working. On the 4th morning, Master Heyman appeared at the base of the ladder leading to the roof. "Come down, both of you," he said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that made every student in the monastery stop what they were doing and listen. "I want to show you something in the garden." He led them to a quiet section of the grounds, where 2 polished bronze mirrors had been positioned facing each other among the autumn flowers. The morning light caught the reflective surfaces, creating a complex interplay of reflections that seemed to multiply infinitely into the distance. Master Heyman gestured for each novice to stand directly in front of one of the mirrors. "Quan," the master said gently, "look into your mirror and tell me what you see." "I see myself, master," Quan replied, though his puzzled expression suggested he wasn't sure why this was relevant to their roofing project. "And when you look at that reflection, what do you think?" Quan was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I see someone who needs to work significantly harder, who could be far more disciplined, and who has a very long way to go before achieving true wisdom." Master Heyman nodded and turned to Minsu. And you, Minsu, what do you see in your mirror? I see someone who keeps making mistakes, Minsu said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes downcast. Someone who isn't good enough, who constantly disappoints others, and who probably doesn't belong in this sacred place. Interesting, Master Heyman said, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. Now I want you each to look directly at the other person and tell me what you see. Quan looked at Minsu and said, I see someone who tries hard but lacks focus and precision, who means well but doesn't apply himself sufficiently to important tasks. Minsu looked at Quan and said, I see someone who's incredibly dedicated and highly skilled. Someone who cares deeply about doing things right and has achieved a level of discipline I can only admire. Master Heyman smiled the gentle smile of a teacher whose students were about to discover something profoundly important about themselves. Do you notice anything interesting about these observations? Both novices looked completely puzzled, so Master Heyman continued. Quan, you use your mirror to examine your own faults with ruthless precision, but when you look at Minsu, you see his faults just as clearly. You are strict with yourself and strict with others. He paused to let this sink in. Minsu, you use your mirror to see only your own inadequacies. But when you look at Quan, you see his strengths and virtues. You are harsh with yourself but gentle with others. But Master, Quan protested, isn't it important to maintain high standards? Shouldn't we expect excellence from ourselves and from others if we are to grow? And Master, Minsu added, isn't it better to be understanding of others' struggles? Shouldn't we be compassionate toward people who are trying their absolute best? Master Heyman picked up a small pebble from the garden path and tossed it gently into a reflection pool beside the mirrors. The ripples distorted both bronze reflections, making them waver and change. Watch how the water responds to the stone, he said softly. Does it become angry at the disturbance? Does it criticize the stone for disrupting its perfect surface? No, Master, both students replied. The water simply accepts the disturbance and gradually returns to its natural stillness. But notice, the water doesn't become chaotic or lose its essential nature because of the ripples. It remains water, clear and pure. Even while adapting perfectly to the stone's impact, he gestured for them to sit on a wooden bench beside the pool. True spiritual strength comes from being exactly like this. Water maintaining your own absolute clarity and purity, while accepting completely that others may create ripples in your environment. This means being strict with yourself, maintaining your own high standards, your own discipline, and your own commitment to growth while being incredibly gentle with others, understanding that they are at entirely different points in their unique journey and may disturb your peace as they learn. But how do we know when to be strict and when to be gentle? Quan asked, his voice reflecting a genuine desire to understand. The key, Master Heyman replied, is understanding what you can and cannot control in this life. You can completely control your own thoughts, your own actions, and your own responses to situations. Therefore, you can and should hold yourself to exceptionally high standards in these areas. But you cannot control others' thoughts, actions, or responses. Therefore, expecting them to meet your personal standards will only ever lead to immense frustration, anger, and conflict. He pointed to the roof of the meditation hall they had been working on. When you make a mistake placing a tile, Quan, you should indeed notice it quickly and correct it immediately. That's being properly strict with yourself. But when Minsu makes a mistake, your job is not to judge him or correct him harshly, but to respond with the exact same patience you would want to receive if you were learning something completely new. And Minsu, he continued, turning to the other novice, when you make a mistake, you should acknowledge it calmly and learn from it, without the harsh, cruel self-criticism that only makes you more nervous and likely to repeat the error. That's being properly strict with yourself, holding yourself accountable without being psychologically cruel. But you should continue to show others the same beautiful compassion you naturally feel, understanding that everyone is struggling in their own unique way. The ancient teachings remind us that we ourselves, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve our own love, kindness, and affection. This teaching reveals the absolute heart of the fourth principle, that true strength comes from applying high standards to yourself while extending deep compassion to others. It's about taking complete responsibility for your own growth while allowing others the space and time to learn at their own natural pace. Master Heyman stood up and walked to a nearby tree whose branches were heavy with autumn leaves. He picked up a fallen leaf and held it gently in his open palm. "This leaf fell because it was entirely ready to fall," he said beautifully. The tree didn't push it off for being imperfect, and the leaf didn't cling desperately to the branch because it feared judgment from the forest. Everything happened in its natural time according to natural law. Your practice should be exactly the same way. Be like the tree rooted firmly in your own values and discipline, growing steadily toward the light, but allowing others to develop according to their own natural timing. Don't try to force others to grow faster than they are ready for, and don't abandon your own growth because others seem to be progressing more slowly. The very following day, Kwan and Minsu returned to their roofing work with dramatically different attitudes. Kwan still maintained his exceptionally high standards for his own work, checking each tile carefully and taking immense pride in precise measurements. But when Minsu made minor errors, instead of criticizing him, Kwan would simply say warmly, "Let me show you a technique that might help make this placement easier," or, "This particular section is incredibly tricky." I had a lot of trouble with it too. When I was first learning, Minsu, meanwhile, began catching his own mistakes much more quickly and correcting them without the internal barrage of cruel self-criticism. "That tile needs to be repositioned," he would say to himself matter-of-factly, the exact same way he might observe that a white cloud was passing overhead. No emotional drama, no self-flagellation, just calm acknowledgement and immediate correction. The change in their working dynamic was truly remarkable. The roof work progressed far more quickly and smoothly than before, but more importantly, both novices felt energized and peaceful, rather than drained by their collaboration. Other students began gravitating toward their work area again, drawn by the beautiful atmosphere of focused calm that had completely replaced the previous tension. Within a single week, their transformation extended far beyond the roofing project. Kwan's relationships with his fellow students improved dramatically as he learned to see their daily struggles with compassion rather than judgment. His own practice became far more joyful and sustainable as he maintained discipline without the harsh self-criticism that had previously driven him. Minsu's practice deepened significantly as he learned to hold himself accountable without cruelty. His natural compassion for others remained entirely intact, but now he extended that exact same kindness to himself. His meditation became more focused, his study more effective, and his service to the community more confident and skilled. Several months later, Master Heyman called both students to join him for evening tea. As they sat together watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the master asked them to reflect on what they had learned. "I learned that being strict with myself doesn't require being harsh with others in any way," Kwan said thoughtfully. "In fact, when I stopped judging everyone else's performance, I became much better at maintaining my own standards. It's like I had been wasting so much energy criticizing others that I didn't have enough left for my own growth." Minsu nodded and added with a smile, "And I learned that being gentle with others doesn't require being cruel to myself. I can hold myself to high standards and correct my mistakes without all the self-hatred that used to paralyze me completely. It turns out that treating myself with the same kindness I show others actually makes me far more effective, not less." Master Heyman smiled with the deep satisfaction of a teacher whose students have grasped not just the technique, but the true spirit of an important teaching. "You have discovered one of the most liberating truths of the path," he said beautifully. "That real strength comes not from being entirely hard or entirely soft, but from knowing exactly when to be firm and when to be flexible, like bamboo that bends in strong winds but never breaks, like water that is soft enough to flow around obstacles, but persistent enough to carve canyons through solid stone." This profound principle transforms how we navigate every single relationship and challenge in our daily lives. In our modern world, we often fall into the exact same traps that Kwan and Minsu experienced. Some of us become harsh critics of everyone around us while making constant excuses for our own failings. Others become so focused on being understanding toward others that we lose all personal accountability for our own growth and behavior. The wise path offers a much better way, taking complete, absolute responsibility for our own thoughts, emotions, and actions, while extending infinite patience and compassion to others as they navigate their own unique learning process. This means noticing immediately when we're being lazy or undisciplined with ourselves and correcting course without drama, while also recognizing that others' apparent shortfalls might reflect internal struggles we can't see or understand. When your coworker arrives late to meetings, instead of judging their character, you can wonder what hidden challenges they might be facing, while ensuring that you yourself are always perfectly punctual. When a family member repeatedly makes the same mistakes, instead of lecturing them, you can offer quiet support while making sure you're learning from your own errors. When a friend seems to be making poor choices, instead of trying to control their decisions, you can be available to help while focusing your energy on making wise choices in your own life. This principle also applies beautifully to how we handle our own mistakes and shortcomings. Being strict with yourself never means being cruel, abusive, or perfectionistic. It simply means holding yourself accountable with the exact same firmness and compassion you would use with a beloved friend who was struggling. It means acknowledging errors quickly and completely, while maintaining absolute faith in your ability to learn and grow. When you make a mistake at work, you can acknowledge it fully, take steps to correct it, and implement systems to prevent similar errors in the future, all without the internal narrative of shame and self-attack that only makes future mistakes more likely. When you fall short of your own standards in relationships, you can apologize sincerely, change your behavior, and recommit to treating others with love without drowning in guilt that serves no constructive purpose. The practical application of this principle requires constant mindfulness and the willingness to catch yourself when you slip into old patterns of judgment or self-pity. Throughout each day, you can ask yourself honestly, am I taking appropriate responsibility for my own thoughts and actions? Am I extending appropriate compassion to others as they navigate their own challenges? This isn't about keeping score or achieving perfect balance, but about developing the wisdom to know when firmness serves growth and when gentleness serves healing. Sometimes being strict with yourself means pushing through resistance to do something difficult but important. Other times, it means being honest about your limitations and asking for help. Sometimes being gentle with others means offering encouragement and support. Other times, it means setting clear boundaries to protect your own well-being. The beautiful result of practicing this principle is that you become unshakable in a very specific way. Your sense of worth and peace no longer depends on others' behavior or approval. When you're completely focused on maintaining your own integrity while accepting others' imperfections, you develop an inner stability that external circumstances can't destroy. You become like the reflection pool capable of returning to absolute stillness, regardless of what stones others might throw into your environment. As you prepare for sleep tonight, bring to mind a relationship where you've been either too harsh with someone else or too lenient with yourself. Consider how you might apply this principle tomorrow. What would it look like to take fuller responsibility for your own growth while extending greater compassion to the other person's struggles? Perhaps there's someone whose behavior has been frustrating you. Instead of trying to change them, you could focus entirely on responding to their actions with wisdom and patience, while ensuring that your own behavior reflects your highest values. Or maybe there's an area where you've been making excuses for your own lack of progress. You could commit to honest self-improvement while treating yourself with the same kindness you'd show a good friend who was facing similar challenges. The fourth principle of becoming unshakable is this: be your own strictest teacher and everyone else's most compassionate friend. Hold yourself accountable with loving firmness, while holding others with patient, kind understanding. In this perfect balance between self-discipline and compassion lies the secret to relationships that energize rather than drain you, to personal growth that feels sustainable rather than punishing, and to an inner peace that remains entirely stable regardless of how imperfectly the people around you behave tomorrow. You'll have countless opportunities to practice this wisdom moments when others disappoint you and when you disappoint yourself. In each of these moments, you can choose to respond with the balanced strength that wisdom teaches, taking full ownership of your part while extending grace to others as they learn theirs. This choice, repeated consistently, becomes the foundation of a life that is both disciplined and compassionate, both strong and gentle, both unshakable and infinitely loving. Principle 5. No one can hurt you without your permission. Deep in the heart of a lush river delta region, where ancient temples rise like prayers carved in dark stone, and the great river flows like liquid gold in the evening light, we encounter perhaps the most challenging yet liberating truth in all of spiritual wisdom. This is the story of a practitioner whose encounter with genuine danger would reveal that the greatest strength lies not in avoiding harm, but in understanding what can and cannot truly be harmed within us. Prepare yourself for a journey that will forever change how you understand your own invulnerability. The year was long ago, during a time when the great kingdom of the Delta was crumbling under the heavy weight of political upheaval and foreign invasion. Across the land, sanctuaries that had stood for centuries were being abandoned. Monks were fleeing to safer regions, and the ancient order that had maintained peace for generations was dissolving into total chaos. Yet, in this time of terror and uncertainty, one specific monastery continued to function exactly as if nothing had changed, not out of ignorance of the physical danger, but out of a profound understanding of what danger actually means. The monastery of the Golden Lotus sat perched on a green hill overlooking a strategic river crossing, making it impossible to ignore the constant stream of refugees fleeing southward, their wooden carts loaded with whatever possessions they could carry, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from losing everything you thought was permanent. Soldiers from various factions would pass through the area regularly, some maintaining strict discipline and order, others little better than lawless bandits taking advantage of the political chaos to enrich themselves through theft, coercion, and intimidation. Within this monastery lived a practitioner named Thura, whose very name meant courageous in the ancient language of the land, though his courage was of a type that most ordinary people would not recognize as such. Thura was not physically imposing at all. He was slight of build, soft-spoken, and possessed the kind of gentle, quiet demeanor that might make him seem an easy target to those who measured strength purely by the ability to intimidate others. But Thura had spent 15 years studying and practicing the deepest teachings of inner peace, and in those teachings he had discovered something that made him essentially invulnerable to physical harm, but to the fear and spiritual damage that such harm is meant to inflict. Unlike many of his brother practitioners who had fled to safer regions when the political situation deteriorated, Thura had chosen to remain at the monastery, continuing his daily routine of meditation, study, and service to the local community, as if the world around him was not falling apart. This wasn't foolish denial of reality. Thura was fully aware of the dangers surrounding him. Rather, it was the expression of a profound understanding about the nature of harm and safety that would soon be tested in the most direct way possible. The ultimate test came on a misty morning, when the autumn fog still clung to the river valley like a silk scarf, muffling sound and creating an atmosphere of unreality that seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. Thura was walking the forest path to the village below, carrying his alms bowl as he had every morning for years, when he suddenly encountered a band of deserters from various armies who had turned to banditry as their means of survival. There were 5 of them, heavily armed with swords and spears, their clothes a mixture of military gear and stolen finery that marked them as men who had abandoned any pretense of honor or discipline. Their leader was a heavy-set man with deep scars across his face and hands that spoke of many violent encounters, his eyes holding the particular hardness that comes from having done things that once seemed entirely unthinkable. When they spotted Thura approaching completely alone on the forest path, they saw what appeared to be perfect prey, a solitary practitioner with no protection, no weapons, and presumably access to whatever wealth the hill monastery might contain. "Stop right there, monk," the leader called out, his harsh voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being obeyed through fear. "We're having a very difficult time lately, and we think your monastery should help us out. Tell us exactly where you keep your gold, your jewels, and whatever valuable donations the faithful have given you over the years." Thura paused calmly on the path and looked at the 5 armed men with an expression that contained absolutely no fear, no anger, and no calculation about escape routes or defensive strategies. Instead, his face held something that the bandits had never seen in any of their previous victims. A kind of gentle curiosity, as if he were encountering an interesting natural phenomenon rather than a life-threatening situation. "Good morning, friends," Thura said, his voice as calm and warm as if he were greeting welcome visitors at the monastery gate. "I can see that you're struggling deeply, and I wish I could help you in the way you're requesting. But our monastery has no treasures or gold to give. We own absolutely nothing beyond the simplest necessities for our practice and service to the poor." The bandit leader's face instantly darkened with anger at what he perceived as defiance disguised as politeness. "Don't lie to us, monk. We know how these places work. Rich devotees bring you offerings of gold and precious stones. You live like kings while pretending to be holy men." He took a heavy step closer, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "Tell us where the treasure is hidden right now, or well, make you tell us. What happened next would be remembered and retold for generations. Not because it was dramatic in the way that stories of heroic battles are dramatic, but because it revealed something about human nature that most people never discover. The profound difference between what can be threatened and what is truly invulnerable." Thura looked directly into the bandit leader's angry eyes with an expression of such complete, absolute peace that it was almost startling in the context of the threatening situation. "My friend," he said gently, "you can certainly harm this physical body if you choose to. You can take my life, cause me intense physical pain, or destroy anything material that I might possess. But you cannot touch what is most essential about me unless I give you explicit permission to do so." "What are you talking about?" the bandit demanded, confusion creeping into his voice alongside the anger. "Are you trying to confuse us with your religious nonsense?" "Not at all," Thura replied, settling into a comfortable cross-legged position on the forest path, as naturally as if he were beginning his morning meditation in the hall. "Simply telling you the truth about what you can and cannot accomplish through violence. You can hurt my body, but you cannot hurt my peace unless I choose to abandon it. You can threaten my life, but you cannot damage my spirit unless I give you that power over me." The bandits exchanged confused, hesitant glances. They were entirely accustomed to victims who begged for mercy, who offered bribes, or who tried frantically to negotiate or escape. They had never once encountered someone who responded to deadly threats with what appeared to be a calm philosophy lesson. One of the younger bandits raised his spear menacingly. "Stop talking in riddles. We want treasure, not a sermon." Thura nodded understandingly. "I know you want treasure, and I truly wish I could provide what you're seeking to ease your poverty. But I want to share something with you that might be even more valuable than gold or jewels." He paused, looking at each of the 5 men with genuine compassion. "Right now, you believe that your survival and happiness depend entirely on taking things from others by force. But this belief is causing you far more internal suffering than any external enemy could ever inflict upon you." "How dare you?" the leader began, but Thura continued speaking in the exact same calm, conversational tone. "Think about your life since you began this path of taking from others," Thura said softly. "Are you truly happier now than you were before? Do you sleep peacefully at night? Do you trust the men standing beside you right now? Or do you constantly worry that they might betray you for a larger share of the spoils? Are you at peace? Or are you always looking over your shoulder, always ready for the next fight, always afraid that someone stronger will do to you exactly what you do to others?" The questions hit their target with surprising razor-like accuracy. The bandit leader's face tightened as he recognized uncomfortable truths in Thura's words. Life as a brigand was indeed a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance, suspicion, and fear disguised as aggression. But admitting this to a solitary monk he was trying to rob felt like an unbearable weakness. "That's none of your business," he snarled, drawing his sword partway from its sheath. "We're not here for your advice. Give us what we want or suffer the consequences." Thura's expression remained completely unchanged, neither fearful nor defiant, but filled with something that seemed almost like deep sadness for the bandit's psychological situation rather than concern for his own safety. "The consequences you're threatening are only painful if I resist them internally," he said simply. "If you choose to harm this body, I will not fight you or hate you for it. If you choose to end this life, I will not spend my final moments in fear or anger. You can take my possessions, but I have already given them up in my heart. You can threaten my future, but I am completely present in this exact moment. What power do you actually have over someone who wants absolutely nothing from you and fears nothing you can do?" The question hung in the damp morning air, like the mist that still clung to the trees around them. For the first time in their criminal careers, the bandits were facing someone who seemed genuinely, completely unaffected by their threats. The very foundation of their power, the ability to create fear in another human being, was proving entirely useless against this calm practitioner who spoke to them as if they were old friends having a discussion, rather than armed men planning violence. The Ancient Ones taught that no one saves us but ourselves. We ourselves must walk the path. What Thura understood deeply, and what the bandits were struggling to comprehend, was that true invulnerability comes not from being physically too strong to be harmed, but from being mentally too free to be controlled by the fear of harm. "You're insane," one of the younger bandits muttered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. There was something profoundly unsettling about threatening someone who seemed genuinely unafraid, who appeared to mean exactly what he said, about accepting whatever they chose to do to his body. Perhaps Thura agreed with a slight warm smile. "But consider this, which of us is truly free? Right now you carry heavy weapons because you're terrified of being defenseless. You travel in a group because you're afraid of being alone. You take from others because you're terrified of having nothing. I sit here with no weapons, no companions, and no possessions worth stealing, and I fear absolutely none of the things you fear. Who is the true prisoner, and who is free?" The bandit leader felt something crack inside his chest, not physically, but emotionally, as if Thura's words had reached through all his hardened armor and touched something he had thought was safely buried forever. He had spent years building an identity around being dangerous, around being someone others feared, around taking what he wanted through force. But facing someone who was genuinely unintimidated by his threats, he suddenly felt the absolute hollowness of that identity, the way it depended entirely on others' fear for its very power. "Stop talking," he said. But the command came out more like a soft plea than an order. Just tell us where the food is so we can be done with this." Thura's voice remained gentle, but it carried an unmistakable note of finality. "There is no hidden treasure here, my friend. The only wealth our monastery contains is the understanding that happiness can never be stolen from others, and peace can never be found through violence. These are treasures that can only be discovered within yourself, and no one can take them from you once you truly possess them." He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his simple robes with the unhurried movements of someone who was completely present in the moment. "You can search our wooden buildings. If you wish, you'll find only brown rice, simple tools, worn books, and sleeping mats. You can harm me if that will somehow serve your purposes, but I cannot give you what you're really looking for. Because what you're really looking for can only be found through understanding rather than acquisition." The bandits stood in confused silence, their weapons still drawn, but their purpose somehow entirely deflated. They had encountered something they had absolutely no framework for understanding. Genuine fearlessness that arose not from courage in the aggressive sense, but from a complete absence of attachment to anything that could be threatened. After what felt like an eternity on that quiet path, the bandit leader slowly resheathed his sword. "This is completely pointless," he said to his companions, his voice entirely lacking its earlier aggression. "There's nothing here for us. as the bandits began to move away into the brush. One of them, the youngest, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, suddenly turned back to look at Thura. "Sir," he called out, "what you said about peace. How does someone find it when they've already done things they can never undo?" Thura's face instantly lit up with genuine warmth and deep empathy. "The exact same way anyone finds it," he said beautifully. "By understanding deeply that what you've done in the past is not who you are in this moment, and that every single moment offers an entirely new choice about who you want to become. The path of peace is always available to you, regardless of where the path of violence has led you." The young bandit nodded once, a gesture that seemed to contain both profound gratitude and a kind of desperate hope, before hurrying to catch up with his companions. As they disappeared into the dense forest, Thura remained standing on the path for several minutes, allowing the encounter to settle into his consciousness. He had just lived through one of the most fundamental demonstrations of inner wisdom, that suffering comes never from external circumstances, but entirely from our internal resistance to and attachment regarding those circumstances. The bandits had fully intended to create suffering through threats and violence, but they had discovered that their power existed only when their targets shared their belief in the absolute importance of material security and physical safety. Thura's genuine detachment from these concerns, not as a philosophical concept but as a lived, daily reality, had rendered their threats entirely meaningless. He could not be controlled through fear because he was simply not afraid of losing what is temporary. He could not be robbed because he owned nothing he was attached to keeping. He could not be diminished because his sense of worth came from sources they could never touch. When Thura returned to the hill monastery that evening and shared his experience with the other practitioners, they were amazed not by his physical bravery, but by his absolute clarity of mind. He had not faced down the bandits through force of will or heroic anger, but through the simple application of understanding that had taken years to develop. He had demonstrated that the deepest teachings of peace are not theoretical but intensely practical, that freedom from suffering is possible not through changing external circumstances, but through changing our fundamental relationship to those circumstances. This profound truth applies to every single form of harm that others might try to inflict upon us throughout our lives. In our modern world, we face different threats than armed Delta bandits, but the principle remains exactly the same. When someone tries to hurt us with harsh words, their power over us depends entirely on our internal attachment to their opinion. When someone attempts to manipulate us through guilt or fear, their success requires our active participation in the emotional drama they are trying to create. When someone tries to diminish our sense of worth through criticism or rejection, they can only succeed if we derive our self-value entirely from their approval. The liberating truth that Thura embodied is that no one can make you feel inferior, worthless, afraid, or diminished without your own cooperation. This doesn't mean that others can't create difficult circumstances, cause physical discomfort, or interfere with your plans. It means that your inner peace, your sense of worth, and your fundamental happiness remain entirely under your own control, regardless of what others choose to do or say. Consider how this applies to common situations in daily life. When someone criticizes your work unfairly, they can affect your external circumstances, but never your inner knowledge of your own competence and worth. When someone tries to make you feel guilty for setting healthy boundaries, they can create temporary discomfort, but never genuine guilt unless you believe you're doing something wrong. When someone attempts to intimidate you into compliance, they can create external pressure, but never internal submission unless you choose to value their approval over your own integrity. The practice of this principle requires developing true detachment, not cold indifference or emotional numbness, but freedom from the compulsive need to have external circumstances be different than they are in the present moment. It means cultivating sources of security, worth, and happiness that are entirely independent of others' actions and opinions. It means recognizing that your true self, your consciousness, your capacity for love, and your essential nature cannot be damaged by external events, no matter how painful they might be. This understanding doesn't make you passive or resigned to poor treatment. Thura could have chosen to fight the bandits, flee from them, or attempt to negotiate with them, and any of these responses might have been appropriate depending on the circumstances. What made him completely unshakable was not his specific physical actions, but his inner freedom from fear and attachment. From this place of inner freedom, he could respond to threats with wisdom rather than reacting blindly from fear, pain, or ego. In practical terms, this principle allows you to set firm boundaries without anger, to receive criticism without defensiveness, to face uncertainty without anxiety, and to encounter hostility without hatred. When you truly understand that others cannot harm your essential self without your permission, you become capable of responding to all situations from a place of strength and clarity, rather than reactivity and fear. The young bandit who asked about finding peace after having done things that can't be undone represents all of us who carry guilt, shame, or regret about past actions. Thura's response reveals another aspect of this principle, that even the harm we've inflicted on ourselves through poor choices cannot permanently damage our essential nature. The path to peace is always available because our true self exists far beyond our history of mistakes and achievements alike. Several years later, that young bandit actually appeared at the Monastery of the Golden Lotus, having left his life of violence completely behind and seeking to understand the peace he had glimpsed in his brief encounter with Thura. He became one of the monastery's most dedicated students, eventually becoming a guide himself who specialized in helping others who had lived through violence and trauma. His transformation demonstrated that the principle of inner invulnerability applies not just to receiving harm, but to recovering from harm we've already experienced or inflicted. As you settle into rest tonight, consider the specific areas of your life where you've been giving others power over your inner peace. Perhaps it's a family member whose approval you constantly seek, a coworker whose criticism instantly affects your mood, or a friend whose judgment influences your self-worth. Notice how much mental and emotional energy you spend trying to control others' reactions to you, trying to prevent them from doing or saying things that might hurt your feelings. Tomorrow, you'll have opportunities to practice this profound truth moments when someone says something harsh, acts inconsiderately, or tries to manipulate your emotions. In each of these moments, you can remember Thura's example and ask yourself, what is this person actually capable of damaging within me? What am I giving them permission to affect that I could choose to keep under my own control? The fifth principle of becoming unshakable is this: no one can hurt you without your permission. Others may create difficult circumstances, but they cannot create suffering within you unless you cooperate with their intentions through fear, attachment, or resistance. Your inner peace belongs to you alone, and you can choose to maintain it regardless of how others choose to behave. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It means understanding the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is often unavoidable, but suffering is optional. Pain is what happens to you. Suffering is what you do with what happens to you. Rest now in the knowledge that your essential self is far beyond the reach of anyone who might wish you harm. Like Thura sitting peacefully on that forest path, you possess an inner sanctuary that no external force can violate without your consent. Tomorrow, when you encounter those who would disturb your peace, you can choose to respond from this place of inner freedom rather than react from fear or need. Principle 6. The power of acceptance. In the fertile river valley of a majestic southern plains region, where a mighty river carved its winding path through landscapes of vibrant green, we discover a teaching that reveals the paradox at the heart of all personal transformation. Here, in a region where seasonal monsoon floods could change the entire geography overnight, lived a landowner whose response to catastrophic loss would illuminate one of wisdom's most misunderstood yet powerful principles. This is the story of how true strength is found, not in fighting what has already happened, but in embracing it so completely that it becomes the solid foundation for something even more beautiful. The village of Prey Veng sat nestled between vast rice paddies that stretched toward the horizon like a green sea, their surface broken only by the occasional palm tree rising like a ship's mast against the endless sky. For generations, The families here had lived in harmony with the river's natural rhythms, understanding that the exact same waters that brought life-giving nutrients to their crops could also bring total destruction when the rains were too heavy or came at the wrong time. It was a landscape that taught its inhabitants the deepest lessons about impermanence, though not everyone learned those lessons with equal grace. Among the village's most respected residents was a man named Chandra, whose family had farmed the same plot of fertile land for over 2 centuries. His great-great-grandfather had first cleared the forest here, building the intricate system of earth dikes and channels that controlled the flow of water through the paddies with an engineering precision that was legendary in the province. Each generation had added to this legacy new terraces carved into hillsides, improved irrigation systems, and fruit orchards planted with varieties selected over decades for their resilience and productivity. By the time Chandra inherited this land, it had become something approaching perfection in its adaptation to the local environment. His agricultural yields were among the highest in the region, and his fruit trees produced abundant harvests that fed not just his own large extended family, but provided a substantial surplus for trade with neighboring settlements. The farm was a living testament to what human patience and wisdom could accomplish when working in partnership with natural forces rather than against them. But Chandra's wealth was not measured only in agricultural productivity. Over the years, he had used the proceeds from his successful farming to build one of the finest houses in the village, a graceful structure of dark timber and bamboo, raised high on thick stilts to protect against seasonal flooding. Its wraparound verandas offering views across the rice fields that seemed to extend forever into the distance. The house was filled with beautiful objects accumulated over a lifetime. Carved wooden furniture crafted by master artisans, fine textiles in colors that caught and held the light like captured rainbows, and bronze statues that seemed to radiate peace into every single room. More precious than any material possession, though, was the beautiful life Chandra had built within these walls. He and his wife had raised 5 children here, watching them grow from toddlers taking their first steps on the polished wooden floors to adults contributing their own labor and wisdom to the family enterprise. The house had witnessed countless celebrations, harvest festivals, where the entire village would gather to share food and stories, wedding ceremonies that lasted for days, and births that brought joy echoing through every room. It was, by any measure, a life of extraordinary success, peace, and contentment. Chandra often said that he felt deeply blessed, that his good fortune was far beyond what any man had a right to expect. He was known throughout the region not just for his prosperity, but for his immense generosity. During difficult years, he would share his surplus food with struggling neighbors, and his home was always open to travelers who needed shelter. Yet Chandra's contentment was about to face the ultimate test in a way that would reveal whether his peace was truly deep or merely dependent on favorable circumstances. The monsoon season of that particular year began normally enough. The rains arrived precisely on schedule, filling the river channels and flooding the rice paddies in the ancient rhythm that had sustained life in this region for thousands of years. Chandra watched with deep satisfaction as his rice plants turned the fields into a carpet of vibrant green, their growth vigorous and healthy in the rich, muddy water. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that this year was entirely different from anything they had experienced before. The rains continued long past their usual stopping point, growing heavier and more violent rather than lighter as the season progressed. The river began to rise far beyond its normal flood stage, first gradually, then with alarming, terrifying speed. Village elders, who had lived through 8 decades of monsoons, shook their heads in utter bewilderment. They had never seen water levels like this in their lifetimes. Chandra and his neighbors worked frantically day and night to reinforce their earth dikes and channels, hauling heavy baskets of earth and stones in a desperate attempt to direct the rising waters away from their homes and fields. For 3 days and 3 nights, the entire village labored together, men and women, young and old, fighting with everything they had against a natural force that seemed completely determined to reclaim the land that human ingenuity had wrestled from its control. On the 4th night, As Chandra stood on his high veranda watching the dark water creep ever higher up the timber support posts of his house, he suddenly realized that all their efforts had been entirely futile. The river had risen far beyond anything their ancestors had ever planned for, far beyond anything their traditional methods could handle. In a few hours, the flood would reach the floor of his house. By morning, everything he had spent his entire life building would be completely underwater. His wife found him there as dawn broke, sitting in a calm meditation posture on the wooden planks of the veranda, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular despite the noise and chaos surrounding them. "Chandra," she said urgently, her voice trembling, "we need to evacuate immediately. The water will be inside the living quarters within the hour. We need to save whatever valuables we can carry and get to higher ground right now." Chandra opened his eyes slowly and looked at his wife with an expression that surprised her with its absolute serenity. "Yes," he said calmly. "We should gather the family immediately and move to safety. But first, I want to watch this happen. I want to see it clearly without fighting it internally or denying its reality." "Watch what happened?" she asked, confusion and fear evident in her voice. "The flood," he said simply. "Our life changing completely, everything we've built being transformed into something else. I want to accept it completely right now so that I can respond to what comes next with wisdom rather than bitterness." And so, as his neighbors ran frantically through the rising waters to save their material possessions, as families loaded carts with whatever they could salvage, and as the village erupted in the total chaos of an emergency evacuation, Chandra sat peacefully on his veranda and watched the flood claim his life's work. He watched as the brown water reached the floor of his house and began to spread across the rooms where his children had played, where his family had shared thousands of meals, and where he had experienced some of the happiest moments of his life. He watched as his beautiful carved furniture began to float, as his fine textiles were soaked and ruined, and as his bronze statues disappeared beneath the muddy torrent. He watched as the vast rice fields that had fed his family for generations completely vanished beneath a brown sea that reflected the gray sky like a mirror of total destruction. But something truly remarkable happened inside Chandra as he witnessed this catastrophe unfold. Instead of feeling the crushing despair and anger that might be expected from someone losing everything they owned, he found himself filled with an unexpected, profound sense of liberation. As each material possession disappeared beneath the water, as each familiar landmark was transformed beyond recognition, he felt a massive weight lifting from his chest, something heavy he hadn't even realized he had been carrying for years. "Look," he said softly to his wife, who had joined him in watching their world transform. "Look how the water doesn't fight against anything. It doesn't argue with the land about where it should go, or complain that our houses are in its way. It simply floats as where the land allows it to flow, accepting completely the shape of whatever contains it." His wife stared at him in absolute amazement. "How can you possibly be so calm, Chandra? We've lost everything: home, our crops, and all our worldly possessions. Don't you feel any anger or grief about what's happening to us?" Chandra was quiet for a long moment, watching a wooden chest that had belonged to his grandfather float past the veranda like a boat without a sailor. "I feel everything," he said finally and honestly. "I feel deep sadness for the loss of beautiful things. I feel natural concern about how well we build our lives. I feel uncertainty about what comes next. But by resisting what has already happened, I would only create suffering. The flood is here. Our house is flooded. Our crops are completely destroyed. These are simply facts now, like the fact that the sun rises in the east. I can accept these facts completely and put all my energy into responding wisely. Or I can resist them internally, rage against the sky, and waste my energy fighting against something that has already occurred and cannot be undone. The ancient sages taught, accept what is, let go of what was, and have faith in what will be." In this moment of devastating loss, Chandra was embodying this wisdom not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived, powerful reality. He was discovering that true acceptance is never passive resignation, but the very foundation of all effective, powerful action. As the water continued to rise, Chandra and his family evacuated to a stone temple situated on much higher ground. joining dozens of other flood refugees in the simple building that had become a temporary shelter. The contrast between their current circumstances and their comfortable life of just a few days earlier could hardly have been more stark. They slept on thin mats on the hard floor, ate simple porridge prepared by the attendants, and wore whatever basic clothes they had managed to save from the flood. But while other refugees spent their days weeping and lamenting their losses, Chandra seemed to approach their new situation with a curious sense of anticipation. "This is incredibly interesting," he would say to his wife as they watched other families arguing about who was to blame for their situation, or complaining about the inadequate conditions in the temporary shelter. "We have an opportunity here that we've never had before in our lives." "What opportunity?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by her husband's unshakable attitude. "The opportunity to start completely fresh," he replied, his eyes bright. "For 30 years I've been managing, maintaining, and expanding what my ancestors built long ago. It was good work and I'm grateful for it, but it was also highly constraining in ways I didn't recognize until now. Every single decision I made had to account for what already existed, had to fit perfectly into patterns that were established long before I was born. Now, the river has given us a completely blank canvas. When the water recedes, we can rebuild in whatever way serves us best today, not just maintain what has always been. We can design a farm that's even better adapted to this environment. We can build a house that better reflects what we've learned about how we actually want to live as a family. We can create something entirely new instead of just preserving something old." His enthusiasm was infectious. Within days, other flood refugees began gathering around Chandra each evening, deeply drawn by his unique ability to see massive possibility where they saw only total loss. Instead of dwelling on what the flood had taken away from them, they began planning what they would create when it was over. "My old rice paddies were far too small and inefficient," one farmer realized thoughtfully. "When I rebuild my dikes, I can combine several plots into larger, far more efficient fields. I always wanted to try growing different types of crops," another added. "Now I can experiment with new varieties. I was afraid to risk before when my fields were established. My house was beautiful, but it was also far too big for our current family needs," a village elder admitted. "We can build something smaller and more appropriate for who we are today, not who we were 20 years ago." What began as informal evening conversations gradually evolved into highly organized planning sessions. The flood refugees, guided entirely by Chandra's perspective that acceptance opens the door to creativity, began designing an entirely new approach to village life. They would rebuild not just what they had lost, but something significantly better, a community that was far more resilient to future flooding, more efficient in its use of land and water, and more beautiful in its integration with the natural environment. 3 months later, when the floodwaters finally receded back into the river channels, what emerged was indeed a completely blank canvas. The landscape had been entirely transformed by the force of nature. Old field boundaries had been completely erased, familiar landmarks had vanished, and the very topography of the valley had been reshaped by the massive movement of water and sediment. To most ordinary people, it would have looked like a scene of utter, hopeless devastation. To Chandra and his fellow villagers, it looked like pure opportunity made manifest. They began rebuilding with an incredible energy and enthusiasm that amazed visiting officials who came to assess the damage. Instead of trying to frantically recreate exactly what had been lost, they implemented the innovative plans they had developed during their months of shelter exile. The new village that emerged was indeed far more beautiful, more functional, and more resilient than what the flood had destroyed. Chandra's new house was smaller than his old one, but far more elegantly and intelligently designed, with better ventilation, more natural light, and a layout that encouraged deep family interaction. His new farm was significantly more productive than the old one, incorporating innovative water management techniques and crop rotation methods that their planning sessions had identified. More importantly, his new life felt far more authentic, more aligned with his actual values rather than inherited expectations. But the most profound transformation of all was in Chandra himself, the experience of losing everything he owned, and discovering that he was not only completely okay, but somehow deeply liberated by the loss, had given him an entirely different relationship with all material possessions and achievements. He worked just as diligently as before, cared for his family just as devotedly, and contributed to his community just as generously. But he held it all far more lightly, with the permanent understanding that everything he built was temporary, and that his happiness was not dependent on any of it remaining unchanged. Years later, when visitors would ask him about the Great Flood and how he had managed to recover from such devastating losses, Chandra would smile and shake his head gently. "I didn't recover from the flood," he would say beautifully. "I was transformed by it. The flood didn't take away my life. It revealed to me what my life actually was, underneath all the things I thought defined it." This story illustrates the profound difference between true acceptance and passive resignation, between surrendering to what is and giving up on what could be. Acceptance is never weak, it's the most powerful foundation for effective action. When we completely stop wasting our energy fighting against what has already happened, we free up all that energy for responding creatively to current circumstances. In our modern lives, we face floods of different kinds: job losses that devastate our financial security, relationship endings that shatter our emotional landscape, health crises that transform our physical capabilities, or sudden events that disrupt our assumptions about how the world works. The principle Chandra embodied applies perfectly to all these situations. Resistance to what has already occurred prevents us from responding wisely to what exists right now. When you lose a job, you can spend months consumed with anger about the unfairness of the situation, dwelling on what you should have done differently, and resenting the people who made the decision. Or, you can accept completely that your employment has ended and put all your energy into exploring what kind of work would actually fulfill you today. What opportunities might exist that weren't available while you were locked into your previous position. When a relationship ends, you can remain stuck for years in bitterness about how your partner failed to appreciate you, replaying old arguments and nursing grievances about their shortcomings. Or, you can accept that this relationship has concluded and focus entirely on understanding what you learned about yourself, what you truly want in future relationships, and how you can grow into someone more capable of lasting love. When illness limits your physical abilities, you can rage against the unfairness of your condition, mourn endlessly for the activities you can no longer pursue, and resist adapting to your new limitations. Or, you can accept your changed circumstances completely and discover what kinds of meaning, joy, and contribution are still possible within your current capabilities. Acceptance never means you have to be happy about difficult circumstances or pretend that losses don't matter. Chandra felt genuine sadness about losing his beautiful home and productive farm. What he didn't do was waste energy insisting that the flood shouldn't have happened, that life was unfair, or that he was a helpless victim of circumstances beyond his control. He felt his natural feelings fully, then put his energy into working with reality as it actually existed rather than as he wished it would be. The practical application of this principle requires developing what wisdom calls beginners mind, the ability to approach even familiar situations with fresh curiosity rather than rigid, fragile expectations. When your carefully laid plans are disrupted, instead of immediately trying to force them back on track, you can pause and ask, what opportunities does this disruption reveal that I couldn't see before? When someone you trust disappoints you, instead of focusing exclusively on how they failed to meet your expectations, you can explore, what does this teach me about the nature of trust and the importance of emotional independence? This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Chandra didn't just sit and wait for his life to improve after the flood. He actively participated in designing and building something better. But his actions came entirely from acceptance of current reality rather than resistance to it, and this made all the difference in their effectiveness and his own peace of mind throughout the process. The deepest teaching of acceptance is that it reveals the creative potential hidden within every single apparent disaster. When we're not wasting energy fighting what has already happened, we become fully capable of seeing possibilities that resistance makes completely invisible. When we're not attached to maintaining things exactly as they were, we become entirely free to explore what they might become. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider what floods have occurred in your own life, what changes, losses, or disruptions you've been resisting rather than accepting. Perhaps it's a recent change that still feels raw and unwelcome. Or maybe it's an old wound that you've never fully allowed to heal because accepting it feels like giving up tomorrow. You'll have opportunities to practice the power of acceptance in small ways when plans change unexpectedly, when other people don't behave as you'd hoped, or when circumstances fail to unfold according to your preferences. In each of these moments, you can choose between resistance and acceptance, between fighting what is and working with what is. The sixth principle of becoming unshakable is this: acceptance is the foundation of all effective action. When you stop fighting what has already happened, you free yourself to respond creatively to what exists now. When you embrace change instead of resisting it, you discover possibilities that were hidden by your attachment to how things used to be. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you like water, which is soft enough to flow around any obstacle, but powerful enough to carve canyons. Principle 7. Living according to nature. High in the rugged foothills of a grand northern mountain range, where eagles soar between snow-capped peaks and the morning mist carries a profound, timeless silence, we encounter a teaching that reveals the deepest secret of effortless living. Here, in a place where the rhythm of the seasons dictates the rhythm of life itself, lived a master whose understanding of natural law would transform how we see our place in the cosmic dance. This is the story of how true power comes not from fighting against life's natural flow, but from learning to move in perfect harmony with forces far greater and wiser than our individual will. The mountain village of Dharamkut clung to the steep hillside like a cluster of colorful flags, its stone houses and terraced gardens carved into slopes so steep that walking from one end of the settlement to the other felt like climbing a sacred peak. Here, where the air was thin enough that every single breath felt precious, and the silence was deep enough that your own heartbeat seemed loud, the cycle of the seasons wasn't just weather, it was the organizing principle of all human existence. Spring brought the melting of high snows that would fill the rushing streams and awaken the sleeping earth. Summer offered brief months of intensive growth when every available hour was spent tending the crops that would sustain life through the long winter ahead. Autumn demanded the wisdom to harvest at precisely the right moment, to preserve and store with the care of someone who understood that survival depended entirely on working with nature's timing rather than human convenience. And winter brought the deep, necessary rest that allowed both the land and the people to gather strength for the cycle to begin fresh. In this village lived a man known simply as Lobsang, whose very presence seemed to embody the peaceful rhythm of the mountains themselves. He had arrived in the village 30 years earlier, as a young seeker fleeing the political turmoil in the crowded lowlands below, carrying nothing but his simple robes and a wooden bowl, seeking only a quiet place to deepen his practice of meditation and study. What he had discovered in those 3 decades was something far more profound than mere retreat from the world. He had learned how to live as an integral part of the natural order, moving through his days with the same effortless grace that governed the movement of clouds across mountain peaks and water down rocky hillsides. Lobsang's daily routine was so perfectly synchronized with natural rhythms that visitors often mistook it for rigid, forced discipline. But those who stayed long enough to observe closely realized they were witnessing something entirely different. A human life lived in such complete harmony with natural patterns that effort and struggle had become almost entirely unnecessary. He would wake naturally as the first light touched the eastern peaks, not because he forced himself to rise early with an effort of will, but because his body had learned to respond to the same subtle cues that awakened the mountain birds and opened the alpine flowers. His morning meditation began as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the pale gold that preceded sunrise, his practice flowing seamlessly into the day's awakening rather than fighting against his natural energy patterns. When the sun crested the mountains and bathed the village in warm light, Lobsang would begin his physical work tending the small garden, where he grew vegetables that fed not just himself but any neighbor who needed fresh food, maintaining the mountain paths that connected the village to the outside world, or helping with whatever seasonal tasks the community required. But his work never felt forced, stressed, or urgent. It never carried that frantic, anxious quality that characterized so many people's efforts to impose their will on circumstances. Instead, he worked exactly like water flowing downhill, taking the path of least resistance while accomplishing exactly what needed to be done, using the minimum energy necessary to achieve maximum effectiveness. What made Lobsang's approach so remarkable was not just its efficiency, but its profound impact on everyone around him. Other villagers found that projects completed far more smoothly when he was involved, that interpersonal conflicts resolved more easily in his presence, and that the overwhelming tasks of mountain life somehow became manageable when approached with his patient, natural timing. Children would follow him around the village, not because he entertained them with games, but because simply being near him felt peaceful in a way they couldn't explain. Even the village animals seemed calmer and more trusting in his presence, as if they recognized in him someone who belonged to the exact same natural order that governed their own lives. Yet, Lobsang's harmony with natural law would face its greatest test through an encounter with someone who represented the exact opposite approach to life, a wealthy merchant from the commercial trading hubs below, whose very presence would illuminate the vast difference between fighting against nature and flowing with it. His name was Kalen Norbu, and he arrived in the mountain village during the peak of summer, carrying the frantic, chaotic energy of the commercial world like a dark storm cloud preceding a tempest. Kalen was highly successful by any external measure. His trading ventures stretched across multiple regions. His caravans carried goods across vast distances, and his wealth allowed him to live in a luxury that most mountain people could barely imagine. But this worldly success had come at a steep psychological cost that was written clearly in the deep, tight lines around his eyes, the constant tension in his shoulders, and the way he seemed completely unable to sit still for more than a few minutes without checking on some urgent business matter. Kalen had come to the mountain village not for spiritual reasons, but because one of his main trading routes passed through the area, and he needed to negotiate with local village authorities about transport permits and tax obligations. His plan was to spend exactly 2 days completing his business, and then return immediately to the high-pressure world of commerce below. He had absolutely no interest in mountain philosophy, no patience for what he viewed as the slow, backward ways of rural life, and no time for anything that didn't directly contribute to his financial objectives. But the mountains, as they often do, had entirely different plans. On Kalen's second morning in the village, a sudden, violent summer storm swept through the region, bringing winds so fierce that travel became physically impossible, and rain so heavy that the mountain paths turned into rushing, hazardous torrents. What should have been a brief business trip suddenly became an extended stay, trapping the highly impatient merchant in exactly the kind of slow, natural environment he spent his entire life trying to avoid. For the first 3 days of his enforced isolation, Kalen paced through the village like a caged tiger, muttering constantly about lost opportunities, delayed shipments, and financial losses. He checked obsessively for any break in the clouds that might allow his escape. His internal agitation was so intense that it seemed to create its own negative atmosphere. Other villagers began avoiding the areas where he spent his time. Children stopped playing near his lodging, and even the usual mountain birdsong seemed muted when he was present. It was on the 4th morning that Kalen encountered Lobsang in a way that would begin to change everything he thought he knew about how life should be lived. The merchant had risen long before dawn, completely unable to sleep due to his intense anxiety about his delayed business, and had wandered outside hoping to find some sign that the weather was clearing. Instead, he found Lobsang sitting in a calm meditation posture in the small garden behind the village temple, perfectly still despite the light rain that continued to fall, his face peaceful in a way that seemed to mock Kalen's inner turmoil. "How can you just sit there so carelessly?" Kalen demanded, his voice sharp with frustration and exhaustion. Don't you understand that this storm is ruining everything? People have serious responsibilities, schedules to keep, and obligations to meet. The world doesn't just stop because the weather is inconvenient to your meditation. Lobsang opened his eyes slowly, the way morning flowers open to greet the sun, and looked at the agitated merchant with an expression of such gentle curiosity that Kalen felt his anger falter slightly. "The world is not stopping at all," Lobsang said quietly, his voice barely audible above the steady sound of rain on leaves. "It is continuing exactly as it always has. This storm is an essential part of the world's movement, not a disruption of it." "That's easy for you to say," Kalen replied, though with less vehemence than before. "You don't have contracts to fulfill, strict deadlines to meet, or people depending on you to deliver goods on time. You can afford to sit in the rain and pretend that schedules don't matter." Lobsang smiled with the deep gentleness of someone who had once carried the exact same heavy burdens that now weighed so heavily on his visitor. "Tell me, Kalen," he said softly, "in all your years of business, have you ever experienced a single season when absolutely everything went exactly according to your plans? When no storms delayed your caravans, no floods blocked your routes, and no unexpected events forced you to adapt your carefully laid schedules?" Kalen paused, caught completely off guard by the practical question. "Well, no," he admitted reluctantly, looking down. "There are always complications, always unexpected problems to solve in commerce. And how much of your vital energy do you spend fighting against these complications?" Lobsang asked. "How much time and peace do you waste being angry about delays you cannot control, frustrated by weather you cannot change, and resentful towards circumstances that are simply the natural flow of events?" The question struck deeper than Kalen wanted to admit. He suddenly realized that he spent enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy raging against situations he was entirely powerless to alter, as if his anger could somehow force the physical world to conform to his personal timeline. "But if I don't push hard against obstacles, how do I get anything accomplished?" he asked, his voice softening. "If I just accept every delay and setback, won't my business fall apart?" Lobsang gestured toward the rain-soaked garden around them, where every single plant and tree was receiving the water it needed to continue growing, where the storm that seemed so disruptive to human plans was actually essential to the mountain ecosystem's health. "Look at how nature accomplishes its goals," he said beautifully. "The river doesn't waste energy fighting against the massive rocks in its path. It flows around them or over them, or gradually wears them smooth over time. The trees don't struggle against the violent wind they bend so they won't break, and actually use the storm's energy to spread their seeds to new ground. The seasons don't try to rush their transition. Spring doesn't try to become summer before the snow has finished melting, and autumn doesn't resist the coming of winter. The ancient ones taught that just as a candle cannot burn without fire, human beings cannot live deeply without an inner life." What Lobsang was revealing to the frustrated merchant was that this inner life is not separate from practical life, but is actually the most practical approach possible, a way of living that accomplishes more with less effort by working with natural forces rather than against them. "Come with me," Lobsang said, rising gracefully from his meditation posture. "Let me show you something that might help you understand what I mean." He led Kalen to the edge of the village where a small stream cascaded down the mountainside in a beautiful series of natural pools and waterfalls. The recent rains had swollen the stream, making its voice louder and its movement more dramatic. But its essential character remained completely unchanged: water following the path of least resistance, while accomplishing the monumental task of carving the mountain landscape over centuries. "This stream," Lobsang said, "travels hundreds of miles from its source high in the peaks to its destination in the great rivers below. It carries tons of sediment, provides water for countless plants and animals, and shapes the very geography of this region. Yet, it never struggles, never forces, and never fights against the terrain. It simply follows natural law, always flowing downward, always taking the easiest available path, and always adapting its course to work with the landscape rather than against it." Kalen watched the clear water tumbling over rocks and around massive boulders, carving channels and pools with a patient persistence that made human urgency seem almost comical by comparison. As a merchant, I've always thought that success requires deadlines, requires pushing hard through obstacles, and requires imposing human will on circumstances. Does it? Lobsang asked gently. Or does successful commerce, like everything else in nature, work best when it flows with natural patterns rather than against them? Think about the most truly successful traders. Do they succeed by fighting blindly against market forces, or by understanding those forces so well that they can work with them perfectly? The question forced Kalen to completely reconsider assumptions he had never once questioned in his adult life. His most profitable and successful ventures had indeed come not from forcing his will on reluctant markets, but from recognizing opportunities that already existed, from timing his actions to coincide with natural business cycles, and from adapting his strategies to work with economic currents rather than against them. The merchants he most respected were those who seemed to have an intuitive, calm understanding of when to act and when to wait, when to push forward and when to step back. "I think I see what you mean," Kalen said slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "But how do you develop this sense of natural timing? How do you know when to act and when to wait?" Lobsang smiled and settled into a comfortable position on a smooth rock beside the stream, indicating that Kalen should join him. "The same way the stream knows which way to flow," he said, "by developing sensitivity to the forces that are already in motion around you, by learning to feel the natural currents, instead of being so intensely focused on your own desires and fears that you miss the vital information the environment is constantly providing." Over the following days, as the storm gradually cleared and Kalen's originally planned 2-day visit stretched into more than a week, the merchant found himself drawn into conversations and observations that challenged everything he thought he knew about effective action. Lobsang showed him how the villagers planned their communal activities around natural cycles, planted their crops according to patterns that had been refined over generations, and timed their major decisions to coincide with natural rhythms that supported, rather than hindered, their goals. "Look at how we approach the harvest," Lobsang explained as they walked through the village's terraced fields. "We don't decide when to harvest based on human convenience, artificial deadlines, or greed. We watch the plants themselves, feel the quality of the mountain air, and observe the behavior of birds and insects that depend on the same cycles we do. When all these natural indicators align perfectly, we know it's time to act. The heavy work flows easily because we're working in partnership with natural forces rather than against them." "But surely this is just old-fashioned farming," Kalen objected mildly. "Does it truly apply to modern commerce, to the complexities of international trade and economics?" Lobsang paused to examine a plant that was just beginning to show signs of ripeness, its leaves changing color in subtle ways that spoke to those who knew how to read nature's language. "Natural law operates at every single level of existence, Kalen. In your business, there are seasons, times when markets are highly receptive to new ideas, and times when they resist change, periods when expansion is natural, and periods when consolidation and rest serve better. There are daily rhythms in human energy and attention that smart merchants learn to work with. There are longer cycles in economic activity that the wisest traders use to time their major moves." As Kalen reflected deeply on this, he began to recognize clear patterns in his own business experience that he had never consciously acknowledged. His most successful negotiations had often occurred when he sensed that all parties were naturally ready to make a deal, when the timing felt organic rather than forced. His most profitable investments had come when he followed quiet hunches about market timing that he couldn't fully explain rationally at the time. His most disastrous ventures had typically resulted from trying to force opportunities that weren't quite ready, from pushing ahead with plans, despite subtle signs that the timing was wrong. "I understand what you're saying," Kalen said thoughtfully. "But how do I develop this sensitivity? How do I learn to read these signs?" "The same way you develop any complex skill," Lobsang replied. "Through practice, quiet attention, and patience. But most importantly, by quieting the constant noise of your own desires and fears long enough to actually notice what's happening around you." He led Kalen to a high lookout point, where they could sit and observe the vast mountain landscape without distraction. Right now, Kalen, your mind is so intensely focused on your business concerns, so preoccupied with your plans, schedules, and metrics, that you're like someone trying to navigate the night forest by starlight while carrying a bright, blinding torch. The torch of your frantic mental activity is completely drowning out the subtle signals that could guide you much more effectively than forced effort. What do you mean by that? Kalen asked. Try this simple practice, Lobsang suggested. For the next few minutes, instead of thinking about your business problems or your delayed shipments, just observe what's happening in this exact moment. Notice the quality of the light on the peaks, the direction of the wind, the sounds of the valley below, and the feeling of tension in your own body. Don't try to do anything at all with this information. Just notice its presence. Kalen found this instruction surprisingly difficult. At first, his mind kept pulling him back to concerns about delayed cargo and missed profit margins. But gradually, as he sat in the silence, he began to notice things he had been far too distracted to see before: the way the afternoon light gave the stone houses a golden quality, the subtle shift in wind direction that suggested the weather patterns were clearing, and the deep, profound quiet of the mountains that felt like a form of nourishment he hadn't realized his soul was craving. Now, Lobsang said softly, after they had sat in observation for several minutes, notice how this quality of attention feels completely different from your usual way of thinking about problems. When you're present and observant like this, do answers and insights arise more easily or with more struggle? To his utter surprise, Kalen found that several complex business problems that had been troubling his mind for weeks suddenly seemed to have completely obvious, elegant solutions, not because he had thought harder about them, but because his mind had finally become quiet enough to notice possibilities that had been there all along. It's like the answers were already present, he said in amazement. But I was far too busy worrying to see them. Exactly, Lobsang said with a smile of deep satisfaction. This is exactly what it means to live according to nature: not to become passive or give up your goals, but to approach them with the same intelligence that guides rivers to the sea and plants towards sunlight. To work with the natural flow of events, rather than exhausting yourself, swimming against currents you cannot change. By the time the weather cleared enough for Kalen to resume his journey, something fundamental had shifted in his approach to life and business. He still had the same goals, the same responsibilities, and the same challenges to navigate, but he carried them completely differently now, with less force and more flow, less struggle and more sensitivity to the natural rhythms that could support his efforts. In the months that followed, Kalen's business associates began to notice profound changes in his approach that they couldn't quite explain. His negotiations became significantly more successful, not because he had become more aggressive, but because he seemed to have an intuitive sense of when others were ready to make decisions. His timing in entering and exiting markets improved, bucking trends, as if he had developed an early warning system for economic shifts. His stress levels decreased markedly, even as his business expanded, because he had learned to work with market forces rather than fighting against them constantly. Most remarkably, Kalen began scheduling regular periods of rest in remote areas, not to escape from his business life, but to reconnect with the natural rhythms that informed his most effective action. He discovered that periods of quiet observation and natural living actually increased his effectiveness in the commercial world, like a river that gains power by gathering momentum in quiet valleys before flowing into the plains below. This principle of living according to nature applies to every single aspect of modern life, from the rhythm of our daily schedules to the timing of our major life decisions. Most of us have lost touch with the natural cycles that once guided human activity. We work under artificial lights that disconnect us from the daily rhythm of sunrise and sunset, live in climate-controlled environments that insulate us from seasonal changes, and eat foods grown according to industrial schedules rather than natural ripening times. Yet, even in our technologically complex world, we can rediscover the wisdom of natural timing and flow. We can notice that our energy and creativity fluctuate naturally throughout the day, and learn to schedule our most important work during our natural peak periods. we can observe that our bodies and minds need regular cycles of activity and rest, intensity and relaxation, social engagement and solitude. Living according to nature means developing sensitivity to the optimal timing for action and rest, for pushing forward and stepping back, for speaking and remaining silent. It means learning to work with your own natural rhythms instead of forcing yourself into schedules that fight against your body's wisdom. It means recognizing that there are seasons in every project, every relationship, and every aspect of lifetimes for planting and times for harvesting, times for growth and times for letting go in relationships. This principle teaches us to respect the natural pace of emotional intimacy, to allow connections to deepen organically rather than forcing premature closeness or clinging to relationships that have completed their natural cycle. In creative work, it guides us to honor the natural rhythm of inspiration and execution, to plant seeds of ideas and patiently tend them until they're ready to bloom, rather than demanding immediate results in problem solving. It encourages us to alternate between active effort and receptive waiting, understanding that solutions often emerge during periods of relaxed attention rather than forced concentration. The deepest teaching of living according to nature is that we are not separate from the natural world, but an integral part of it, subject to the same laws that govern the movement of tides and the changing of seasons. When we align ourselves with these larger patterns, our individual efforts become supported by forces far greater than our personal will. We discover that we can accomplish more with less effort, not through laziness, but through intelligent cooperation with the natural flow of events. As you settle into rest tonight, feel yourself as part of the natural rhythm that brings sleep after wakefulness, rest after activity, and restoration after exertion. Notice how your body naturally relaxes when you stop fighting the approach of sleep, how your mind settles when you allow thoughts to slow rather than forcing them to stop. This is a perfect example of living according to nature, working with your natural rhythms rather than against them. Tomorrow, you'll have countless opportunities to practice this principle in small ways, timing your important conversations for moments when others are naturally receptive, scheduling your challenging tasks for times when your energy is naturally high, and allowing projects to unfold at their natural pace rather than forcing artificial deadlines. Each time you choose to flow with natural timing rather than fight against it, you become a little more like Lobsang, a little more like the mountain stream that accomplishes everything it needs to do without struggle or strain. The seventh principle of becoming unshakable is this: align yourself with the natural flow of life, rather than exhausting yourself swimming against invisible currents. Learn to read the subtle signs that indicate when action is called for, and when patience will serve you better. Develop sensitivity to the natural rhythms that govern everything from your daily energy cycles to the larger patterns of growth and change in your life. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you far more effective, like a sailor who uses wind and current instead of fighting against them. It makes you more peaceful, like a tree that bends with storms instead of breaking. Most importantly, it reconnects you with your place in the larger web of existence, helping you remember that you are not fighting against life, but dancing with it. Principle 8, the foundation of ethical living. In the ancient historic port city of Rivermouth, where a broad river meets the rolling sea and merchants from across the globe once gathered to trade in silk, timber, and precious goods, we encounter a teaching that reveals the invisible foundation upon which all lasting happiness is built. Here, in a place where fortunes were made and lost on the strength of a man's word, where trust was more valuable than gold and reputation more precious than any cargo, lived two merchants whose different approaches to business would illuminate one of wisdom's most practical yet profound truths. This is the story of how the quality of our actions shapes not just our external circumstances, but the very nature of our inner world. The city was a bustling hub of international commerce, a place where merchants of a dozen languages mingled in the narrow streets that wound between ancient stone temples and sprawling marketplaces. The air was thick with the scent of spices and processed timber, the sounds of constant negotiation, and the salt tang of the sea that carried ships laden with dreams of prosperity from distant shores. It was a city where anything could be bought or sold, where clever men could become wealthy in a single season, and where the line between legitimate business and profitable deception was often blurred by the intoxicating possibility of quick riches. Among the many traders who had made Rivermouth their home were two men whose names would become legendary in the merchant community, though for very different reasons. The first was Julian, a textile trader whose family had been in the business for 3 generations, inheriting not just warehouses and trade connections, but a reputation for absolute honesty that had become as valuable as any physical asset. The second was Malachor, an ambitious merchant who had arrived in the city 5 years earlier, with nothing but sharp intelligence, immense ambition, and a willingness to bend rules whenever profit demanded it. Julian approached business with what some of his competitors considered naive simplicity, but what he understood as sophisticated wisdom passed down through generations of successful trading. Every bolt of fabric that left his warehouse was exactly what he claimed it to be: the quality, represented honestly, the origin stated accurately, and the price set fairly based on actual value rather than whatever the desperate market might bear. When he told a buyer that a particular fabric would wear well for 10 years, his customers knew they could make plans based entirely on that information. When he promised delivery on a specific date, merchants across the region would schedule their own activities, knowing that Julian's shipments would arrive precisely when expected. This approach to business had been taught to him by his father, who had learned it from his father before him, along with a simple saying that had guided their family's commercial activities for decades: the mind is everything. What you think, you become. This wasn't just abstract philosophy to Julian. It was the practical foundation of everything he did. He understood deeply that every lie told in the name of profit didn't just deceive the customer. It also shaped the mind of the person telling the lie, making future deceptions easier and eroding the inner foundation of peace that true prosperity required. Each time I speak truthfully in business, Julian would tell his son, as they walked through the warehouse, examining merchandise in the early morning light, I strengthen my capacity for truthfulness in all areas of life. Each time I treat a customer fairly, even when I could easily take advantage of their ignorance. I build the kind of character that attracts good fortune, rather than having to chase after it. Each time I choose integrity over immediate profit, I invest in a reputation that will bring me more business than any clever scheme ever could. This philosophy had served the family remarkably well. Julian's warehouse was always busy with loyal customers who knew they could trust his merchandise and his word completely. His profit margins were smaller than those of merchants who used deceptive practices, but his volume was enormous because satisfied customers returned season after season and recommended him to others. More importantly, Julian slept peacefully each night, faced each day with absolute confidence, and conducted his business with the relaxed authority of someone who had nothing to hide and no one to fear. Malachor represented a completely different approach to commerce, one that was becoming increasingly common in the competitive atmosphere of the port's expanding markets. Where Julian saw business as a long-term relationship-building exercise, Malachor viewed it purely as a series of individual transactions to be optimized for maximum immediate gain. Where Julian prioritized trust and reputation, Malachor focused entirely on cleverness, positioning, and opportunity. Where Julian made modest profits through honest dealing, Malachor pursued massive gains through whatever means the law allowed, and sometimes slightly beyond. Malachor's methods were sophisticated and, in their own way, brilliant. He would purchase textiles from small producers in the countryside, telling them it was for local use and negotiating lower prices accordingly, then export it at international rates for substantial profits. He would blend lower quality fibers with premium threads in proportions that were virtually impossible to detect without expert examination, selling the mixture at prices appropriate for pure merchandise. He would promise delivery dates that he knew were highly optimistic, calculating that the profits from early sales would easily offset the future costs of disappointed customers. These tactics allowed Malachor to undercut competitors like Julian and rapidly expand his business operations. Within 3 years of arriving in Rivermouth, he had acquired 2 large warehouses, a fleet of trading vessels, and enough wealth to build one of the finest houses in the merchant quarter. By all external measures, he was extraordinarily successful, and many younger merchants began imitating his methods, viewing traditional approaches like Julian's as outdated, slow, and unnecessarily restrictive. But this rapid success had come with massive, hidden costs that Malachor was only beginning to recognize, costs that would soon threaten everything he had built. The constant need to remember exactly which lies he had told to which customers created a mental burden that grew heavier each season. The fear of being discovered in his various deceptions meant that he could never fully relax or enjoy his prosperity. Most troubling of all, the habits of mind that served him in business had begun to infect other areas of his life. He found himself deceiving close friends, family members, and even himself about matters that had absolutely nothing to do with commerce. The profound difference between these two approaches to business would be dramatically revealed during a major regional crisis that tested not just their commercial practices, but the very foundations of their character. A devastating storm had struck the production regions to the north, destroying much of the year's raw crop and creating a severe shortage that drove market prices to unprecedented, astronomical levels. Both merchants found themselves with existing inventory that was now worth far more than they had originally paid for it, and both faced the exact same ethical dilemma: honor their existing commitments to sell to old buyers at previously agreed prices, or find ways to capitalize on the sudden scarcity for massive profit. Julian's response was immediate and unwavering. He contacted every single customer who had placed orders at pre-storm prices and assured them that he would honor every commitment exactly as agreed. A man's word is his bond, he told his son as they prepared shipments that would bring them far less profit than current market conditions would allow. When we make a solemn promise, we keep it, regardless of changed circumstances. This is not just about business contracts. This is about who we choose to be as human beings. Malachor saw the exact same situation as a golden opportunity for extraordinary life-changing profit. He began contacting customers with existing orders, explaining untruthfully that the storm had affected his supply chains in ways that required major price adjustments to reflect current market realities. Customers who refused to pay the higher prices found their orders mysteriously delayed due to quality control issues or shipping complications. Meanwhile, Malachor sold his existing high-quality inventory to new, wealthy customers at premium prices, justifying the practice as simply responding to market forces. In the short term, Malachor's strategy appeared to be entirely vindicated. He earned profits in a single season that exceeded what Julian made in 3 years of steady, honest business. He expanded his operations further, acquired more warehouses, and became known throughout the region as one of the most successful merchants of his generation. Younger traders flocked to learn his methods, impressed by his ability to turn a crisis into a gold mine. But the true test of their different approaches would come not in immediate profits, but in long-term consequences that neither man could have fully anticipated. Word of how each merchant had handled the storm crisis spread quickly through the trading networks that connected the port to the rest of the world. Customers who had been protected by Julian's integrity during the shortage began recommending him to partners and associates across the region. When times are difficult, they would say, "Julian is the one man you can trust to treat you fairly." His reputation for absolute reliability became so strong that customers began placing larger orders further in advance, knowing they could count on his commitments regardless of market fluctuations. Meanwhile, Malachor discovered that his clever handling of the crisis had created unexpected, serious problems. Customers who had been forced to pay higher prices or had their orders canceled became vocal critics of his business practices. Word spread through merchant networks that Malachor's commitments were conditional, that his prices could change without notice, and that his promises were only as reliable as current market conditions made convenient. New customers began demanding increasingly detailed legal contracts with severe penalty clauses, driving up the administrative and legal costs of every transaction. More seriously, Malachor found himself in a business environment where trust had become entirely scarce. Suppliers demanded full payment in advance because his reputation for changing terms had made them nervous about credit arrangements. Customers insisted on inspecting merchandise more thoroughly because rumors about his quality claims had made them deeply suspicious. Partners required complex legal agreements because his previous tactics had demonstrated that his word alone could never be relied upon. The administrative burden of operating in this low-trust environment began consuming enormous amounts of his time and energy. Malachor found himself spending his days managing the complex web of contracts, inspections, and verification procedures that his reputation required, rather than focusing on the actual business of buying and selling. The mental stress of keeping track of his various commitments and their conditions created a constant state of anxiety that no amount of profit could relieve. But the most profound impact of all was on Malachor's inner world. The mind is everything, and Malachor was discovering the practical truth of this teaching in ways he had never expected. Years of thinking deceptive thoughts, of calculating how to mislead others for profit, and of justifying questionable practices had gradually shaped his mind in directions that now deeply troubled him. He found it difficult to trust anyone because he assumed they were using the exact same deceptive tactics he employed. He struggled to enjoy his wealth because he constantly worried about competitors trying to outsmart him the way he had outsmarted others. He had trouble sleeping peacefully because his mind was always working on schemes and defensive strategies, unable to rest in the simple satisfaction of honest work well done. Most disturbingly, he realized that he had begun lying to himself, rationalizing behaviors he once would have recognized as wrong. The contrast with Julian's experience was striking. While Malachor's profits had initially been higher, Julian's business had grown steadily and sustainably over the years following the crisis. His reputation for integrity had become so valuable that customers would often pay slightly higher prices, simply for the peace of mind that came with dealing with a completely trustworthy merchant. More importantly, the quality of Julian's daily experience was entirely different from Malachor's constant stress and hypervigilance. "I wake each morning knowing that I have absolutely nothing to hide and no one to fear," Julian explained to a younger merchant who had asked about his approach to business. "When customers contact me, genuinely happy to hear from them because our relationships are based on mutual benefit rather than my advantage over them. When I make commitments, I feel confident rather than anxious because I know I'll honor them regardless of circumstances. When I lie down at night, my mind is completely clear and peaceful because my actions during the day have been perfectly aligned with my values." The profound difference between the two merchants illustrates the timeless law of cause and effect, the completely practical principle that the quality of our actions determines the quality of our experience. Every ethical choice creates conditions that support peace, trust, and sustainable success. Every unethical choice creates conditions that require constant vigilance, complex management, and ultimately undermine the very goals they were meant to achieve. This principle extends far beyond business into every single area of human life. In relationships, honesty creates the foundation for deep intimacy and trust, while deception creates the need for careful management of stories and a constant fear of discovery. In personal goals, integrity allows us to build steadily on solid foundations, while cutting corners creates instability that eventually requires much more energy to maintain than honest effort would have required. In social interactions, treating others with genuine respect creates an environment where we ourselves are treated well, while manipulation creates a social world where everyone is suspicious and defensive. The practical application of ethical living begins with understanding that every choice is simultaneously an action in the world and a shaping of our own character. When we tell the truth, we not only provide accurate information to others, but also strengthen our own capacity for truthfulness. When we act with compassion, we not only help others, but also cultivate compassion within ourselves. When we choose courage over convenience, we not only address the immediate situation, but also become more courageous people. This understanding transforms ethics from a burden imposed by external rules into a highly practical strategy for creating the kind of life we actually want to live. We choose integrity not because we're forced to, but because integrity creates the conditions for peace, trust, and sustainable happiness. We choose compassion not because it's required by law, but because compassion creates the kind of relationships and social environment that support our well-being. We choose courage not because we have to, but because courage creates the ability to live authentically and pursue what truly matters to us. In our modern world, where success is often measured by speed and cleverness rather than character and sustainability, Malakor's initial approach can seem highly appealing on the surface. We're surrounded by examples of people who appear to prosper through cutting corners, bending rules, or prioritizing short-term gains over long-term integrity. But if we look closely at the actual quality of their lives, their relationships, their peace of mind, and their ability to trust and be trusted, almost always find the same hidden, exhausting costs that Malakor discovered. The path of ethical living doesn't guarantee external success by conventional measures, but it does guarantee the kind of internal success that makes external achievements meaningful. When our actions align with our deepest values, we experience the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. When we build our lives on foundations of honesty and integrity, we create stability that can weather any external storm. When we treat others with genuine respect and kindness, we actively participate in creating the kind of world we want to live in. Several years after the crisis, Malakor made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Faced with yet another opportunity for highly profitable deception, he found himself entirely unable to go through with it. The constant stress of managing his reputation and the growing isolation that came from being known as someone who couldn't be trusted had finally become unbearable to his spirit. Instead of pursuing the questionable deal, he sought out Julian and asked to learn about a different approach to business and life. "I've been successful by many measures," Malakor admitted honestly to the older merchant, "but I am deeply unhappy. I don't trust anyone because I assume they're trying to deceive me, the way I've deceived others. Can't enjoy my wealth because I'm always worried about protecting it from people who might use my own tactics against me. I've built a life that requires me to be someone I don't want to be anymore." Julian listened with the compassion of someone who understood how easy it is to lose your way in the intense pursuit of success. The good news, Malakor, is that every single moment offers an entirely new choice. You can't change what you've done in the past, but you can decide who you want to become from this moment forward. The habits of mind that serve dishonesty can be replaced by habits that serve integrity, but it requires the exact same patience and consistency that building any complex skill requires. Malakor's transformation didn't happen overnight. Years of deceptive thinking had created deep mental patterns that took time and conscious effort to change. But gradually, as he began making choices based on integrity rather than immediate advantage, he discovered that his business relationships became more pleasant, his stress levels decreased, and his sleep improved dramatically. Most importantly, he began to trust himself again, knowing that his word meant something real, and that his actions were aligned with his deeper values. As you settle into rest tonight, reflect on the choices you made today, not to judge yourself harshly, but to understand how your actions are actively shaping your inner world. Notice areas where acting with greater integrity might create more peace and sustainability in your life. Consider how your choices are contributing to the kind of relationships and social environment you want to experience. Tomorrow, you'll have countless opportunities to practice ethical living in small ways that create the foundation for unshakable inner peace. Each moment when you choose truth over convenience, kindness over indifference, and courage over comfort, you're not just affecting the immediate situation. You're becoming someone whose actions naturally align with your deepest values. The eighth principle of becoming unshakable is this: the quality of your actions determines the quality of your experience. When you live ethically, acting with integrity, compassion, and courage, you create conditions that support peace, trust, and sustainable happiness. When you act without regard for ethics, you create conditions that require constant management and ultimately undermine your own well-being. This isn't about being absolutely perfect, but about understanding that every choice is an opportunity to become more aligned with who you truly want to be. Principle 9. The transformative power of gratitude. In the golden agricultural fields of a beautiful valley region, where the evening light transforms ordinary landscapes into scenes of incredible beauty, and the sound of distant bells carries across valleys filled with the promise of harvest, we discover a teaching that reveals how the simple shift of human attention can transform suffering into joy. Here, in a community where two farmers would face identical devastating losses, yet emerge with entirely different experiences of life itself, we encounter the ninth principle that makes the human spirit truly unshakable. This is the story of how gratitude becomes not just an attitude, but the alchemical force that transmutes any experience into wisdom and peace. The village sat nestled in a rich river valley, where generations of farmers had cultivated crops, using methods passed down through centuries of patient observation and accumulated wisdom. The landscape was a masterpiece of human cooperation, with natural forest terraced plots that climbed the hillsides like green staircases, irrigation channels that directed water with the precision of a master craftsman, and simple wooden houses built on stilts that had weathered countless seasons while maintaining their graceful beauty. During harvest time, the entire valley would shimmer like pure gold in the evening light, as thousands of plants bent their heavy heads under the weight of grain that would sustain the community through another year. Among the village's most respected residents were two farmers, whose lives would become intertwined in a way that would teach everyone who witnessed their story something profound about the nature of human happiness and suffering. The first was Somchai, a man whose approach to life had been shaped by a philosophy passed down through generations of his family. The understanding that gratitude is not just a response to good fortune, but a way of seeing that transforms any circumstance into an opportunity for appreciation. The second was Boone, equally hardworking and dedicated, but whose attention had been trained by life's difficulties to focus primarily on what was missing, what was wrong, and what threatened his security and peace. Both men had worked their fields for over 20 years. Both had raised families through the patient labor of agriculture, and both had weathered the usual challenges that come with, depending on weather, markets, and the countless variables that affect rural life. Their farms were of similar size and productivity, their families equally loving and supportive, and their positions in the community equally respected. Yet, their daily experiences of the exact same basic circumstances were as entirely different as sunrise and storm, illustrating how the lens through which we view life determines the quality of life itself. Somchai began each day with a simple practice that his grandmother had taught him when he was barely old enough to walk between the crop rows without getting lost. Before leaving his house, he would stand on his wooden porch and spend a few moments acknowledging specific things for which he felt grateful, not grand, abstract concepts, but particular, immediate realities. The sound of his wife's laughter from the kitchen as she prepared the morning meal. The way early sunlight painted the distant peaks in shades of gold and purple. The physical health that allowed him to work with his hands in the rich earth, and the rain that had fallen during the night to nourish his growing crops. Gratitude, Somchai would tell his children as they walked together to the fields, is exactly like good eyesight. It doesn't change what is physically present, but it allows you to see clearly what was always there. Most people walk through their lives like someone with clouded vision, aware only of the large, obvious problems while completely missing the countless small miracles that surround them every single moment. This practice of deliberate attention had shaped Somchai's entire experience of farming. When his plants grew strong and healthy, he felt a deep appreciation not just for the eventual harvest, but for the daily miracle of seeds transforming into food through the mysterious alchemy of soil, water, and sunlight. When insects threatened his crops, he felt grateful for the birds that helped control pest populations, and for his own knowledge of natural methods to protect his plants. When prices were good at market, he appreciated the prosperity, and when prices were poor, He appreciated having abundant food to feed his family regardless of its monetary value in the city. Boone approached the exact same life from a fundamentally different perspective, though he would have been deeply surprised to learn how different his mental habits were from his neighbors. Boone was not a negative or unkind person by nature. He worked hard, cared deeply for his family, and contributed generously to community projects. But somewhere along the way, he had learned to organize his attention entirely around problems to be solved, threats to be avoided, and inadequacies to be remedied. His mind had become trained to scan his environment constantly for what was wrong, what was missing, and what could go wrong in the future. When Boone looked at his fields, he primarily saw the plants that were growing more slowly than others, the sections where water distribution wasn't perfectly optimal, and the signs of potential insect damage that would need to be addressed immediately. When he went to market, he focused intensely on how his prices compared unfavorably to what other farmers were receiving, how much his expenses had risen compared to previous years, and how uncertain the overall economic situation was becoming. When he returned home in the evening, his conversations with his family centered almost exclusively on the day's problems and tomorrow's worries, rather than the day's satisfactions and accomplishments. Both approaches to attention had practical effects beyond just subjective experience. Somshay's habit of noticing what was working well in his farming operation allowed him to build on successes and recognize patterns that led to consistently better results. His deep appreciation for his family's support motivated them to continue helping enthusiastically with the hard work. His gratitude for community relationships led to generous cooperation that benefited everyone during difficult times. His general contentment with life made him pleasant to be around, which naturally attracted friendships and business relationships that enriched his life in countless ways. Boone's intense focus on problems also had practical effects, though not always the ones he intended. His constant attention to what was wrong made him highly skilled at identifying and solving specific technical difficulties, but it also made him anxious, stressed, and pessimistic in ways that negatively affected his decision-making. His family began to associate conversations with him with stress and worry, which made them less likely to share their own experiences and ideas freely. His relationships in the community became primarily transactional rather than genuinely supportive, because interactions with him felt emotionally draining rather than energizing. The dramatic difference between these two approaches to life would be revealed most clearly during a difficult season, when both men would face identical losses that would test everything they believed about gratitude, suffering, and resilience. The seasonal rains that year arrived exactly on schedule and brought precisely the amount of water that experienced farmers knew their crops needed. Both Somchai and Boone planted their fields with the accumulated wisdom of decades using seeds saved from their best previous harvests, preparing the soil with methods their grandfathers had perfected, and timing every activity to align with natural cycles. The early growth was incredibly promising, with strong green shoots emerging from the soil like prayers of hope rising toward the sky. But just 3 weeks before the harvest, disaster struck in the form of a massive swarm of migratory pests that descended on the valley like a living storm cloud. These were creatures driven from their normal territory by an unprecedented drought in neighboring regions, arriving in numbers that no one in the valley had ever experienced and consuming the crops with the desperate hunger of creatures facing starvation. In 3 days, they destroyed nearly 80% of both men's crops, leaving behind fields that looked as if they had been swept by fire rather than visited by wildlife. The economic impact was devastating for both families. A full year's hard labor had been reduced to barely enough grain to feed their individual households through the coming winter months, with absolutely nothing left over to sell for cash to cover other expenses. Both men faced the prospect of borrowing money to survive until the next planting season, with no guarantee that similar disasters wouldn't occur again. Both had to tell their children that there would be no money for new clothes, no surplus to share with extended family members who were struggling, and no resources to contribute to the community projects they had been planning. Yet, Their responses to this identical catastrophe were so profoundly different that neighbors who witnessed both would remember the contrast for the rest of their lives. Boone's reaction was everything that might be expected from someone facing such a devastating loss. He spent days walking through his ruined fields, consumed with intense anger at the pests, at the weather patterns that had driven them to his valley, and at the complete unfairness of losing an entire year's work to circumstances completely beyond his physical control. He calculated and recalculated his financial losses in his head, each review making the situation seem more hopeless and dark. He worried obsessively about how he would feed his family, pay his debts, and maintain his standing in the community. "Why did this terrible thing happen to us?" he would ask his wife each evening, his voice heavy with the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. "We worked harder than anyone in the village, planned better than most, and did everything right according to generations of wisdom. What is the point of all that effort if it can be completely destroyed in 3 days by something completely outside our control?" Boone's focus on the disaster consumed so much of his mental and emotional energy that he became entirely unable to see anything else clearly. The 20% of his crop that had survived seemed insignificant and useless compared to the 80% that was lost. The emotional support offered by neighbors felt inadequate and empty compared to the enormity of his losses. The beauty of the valley, the health of his family, the roof over their heads, the knowledge and skills that would allow him to farm again next year, all of these became completely invisible to him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his focus on what had been taken away. Somshe's response to the same catastrophic loss demonstrated the transformative power of gratitude in ways that would be talked about in the village for generations. When he first saw his devastated fields, he felt the exact same initial shock, grief, and pain that any farmer would experience when witnessing the destruction of a year's labor. He sat among the ruined plants and wept openly, not just for his economic losses, but for the beauty that had been destroyed, for the dreams that would have to be postponed, and for the stark reality that life was fragile and unpredictable in ways that no amount of hard work could completely control. But after allowing himself to fully feel the natural pain of loss, Somchai deliberately began to practice the same attention to gratitude that had guided him through 20 years of life. "This is a terrible blow," he said to his wife as they surveyed the damage together. "But let us see what we can find to be genuinely grateful for even in this dark situation." What he found surprised even his wife. "I am deeply grateful that we still have some crop left, not as much as we wanted, but enough to keep our family from starving. I am grateful that this happened after several decades of good harvests that allowed us to save some resources for emergencies. I am grateful that our neighbors are offering to share what they have, showing us that we are part of a community that truly cares for each other during difficult times." As the days passed, Somshai's practice of grateful attention revealed more and more aspects of their situation that could be appreciated despite the obvious losses. "I am grateful that this disaster is teaching our children about resilience and the importance of helping each other during hard times. I am grateful that losing this harvest is forcing us to simplify our lives in ways that might actually be healthier for our family. I am grateful that we have the knowledge, health, and strength to plant again next year, and that this valley's soil is still as fertile as ever." The wise ones taught, "Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn a lot today, at least we learned a little." Somchai embodied this teaching perfectly by finding genuine appreciation even for the painful lessons hidden within disaster. "I am grateful," he told his eldest son, "that this experience is teaching me how much I had taken for granted during the years when everything went well. I am grateful that it's showing me how strong our family bonds are when we face difficulties together. I am grateful that it's reminding me that true happiness never depends on having everything go according to our plans." The practical effects of these different approaches to the same catastrophe were truly remarkable. Boone's intense focus on loss and injustice left him paralyzed by resentment and despair, unable to take constructive action or accept help gracefully from others. His constant rehearsal of grievances poisoned his relationships with family members who were trying to support him, and neighbors who were offering assistance. His inability to see anything positive in their situation made recovery seem impossible, and the future appear entirely hopeless. Somche's practice of gratitude, even in the midst of genuine hardship, had completely different results. His appreciation for what remained gave him immediate energy to make the best use of their limited resources. His gratitude for community support motivated others to continue helping him enthusiastically, and created deep relationships that would benefit his family for years to come. His ability to find meaning and growth opportunities within disaster transformed a potentially devastating experience into a period of unexpected spiritual and family development. Most remarkably, Somche's harvest the following year was the most abundant he had ever achieved, not because of any external factors like weather or markets, but because his response to the previous year's disaster had deepened his relationships with neighbors, who now shared knowledge and resources more freely, had motivated his family to work together more cooperatively, and had clarified his priorities in ways that made him more effective and efficient in all his activities. Boone's experience was exactly the opposite. His continued focus on the injustice of the pest disaster had created a chronic mental and emotional state that made every aspect of farming more difficult. His resentment had severely damaged relationships that could have supported his recovery. His pessimism had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, causing him to make decisions based on fear and scarcity rather than wisdom. Even when his crops grew normally again, he could find no satisfaction in the achievement because his attention remained focused on what he had lost in the past. The transformation that gratitude creates is not just subjective, but profoundly practical. When we train our attention to notice what we can appreciate, we literally change the quality of information our minds have to work with. Instead of spending vital mental energy on resentment and worry, we free that energy for creative problem-solving and relationship building. Instead of seeing only obstacles and limitations, we begin to notice opportunities and resources that were always present but previously invisible. In our modern world, we face different challenges than rural farmers, but the principle remains exactly the same. When we lose a job, we can focus entirely on the injustice and uncertainty, or we can find genuine appreciation for the opportunity to discover work that might be more fulfilling, for the skills and experience that no one can take away from us, and for the relationships that support us during transitions. When a relationship ends, we can dwell on what we've lost, or we can feel grateful for what we learned, for the love we experienced, and for the freedom to create something new. The practice of gratitude is never about pretending that difficulties don't exist or that losses don't matter. Somche felt genuine grief about his destroyed harvest and took practical steps to address his family's needs. Gratitude is about expanding our vision to include the full complexity of any situation, acknowledging problems while also recognizing resources, feeling sadness about losses while also appreciating what remains, and facing uncertainty while also noticing the countless ways that life continues to support us. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider the lens through which you've been viewing your own life recently. Notice whether your attention has been trained primarily on problems, lacks, and threats, or whether you've been practicing the kind of grateful seeing that Somche demonstrated. This is not about judging your current habits, but about recognizing that attention is trainable and that changing how you see changes what you experience. The ninth principle of becoming unshakable is this: gratitude transforms any experience by expanding your vision to include what can be appreciated, alongside what needs to be addressed. When you train your attention to notice what you can genuinely appreciate, not ignoring problems, but including blessings, you change the quality of your experience itself. Like Somche walking through his fields with eyes trained to see abundance even in the midst of scarcity, you can learn to find genuine reasons for appreciation regardless of what life brings. Principle 10. Trust the process and let go of control. In the ancient peaceful gardens of a historic cultural capital, where cherry blossoms fall like soft snow in spring and every single stone has been placed with the patience of centuries, we arrive at the final teaching that transforms uncertainty from an enemy into an ally. Here, where masters spent entire lifetimes learning that true mastery comes not from controlling outcomes, but from perfecting the art of letting go, we discover the principle that makes all other wisdom possible. This is the story of how surrendering control paradoxically gives us the greatest power of all, the ability to flow with life rather than fight against it. The famous rock garden of a historic temple was renowned throughout the land. 15 meticulously selected stones, arranged in a bed of white gravel with such perfect simplicity that visitors would sit on the wooden verandas for hours trying to understand what made the arrangement so profoundly moving. The garden was tended by dedicated practitioners who had elevated the simple act of raking gravel into a high form of moving meditation, each stroke of the wooden rake both maintaining the garden's perfection and accepting its constant need for renewal. Here, where impermanence was celebrated rather than resisted, lived a wise guide named Master Kenji, whose understanding of letting go would soon be tested in the most deeply personal way possible. Master Kenji had devoted 30 years to perfecting his art, not just the maintenance of the physical garden, but the deeper art of living in perfect harmony with change. Each morning long before dawn, he would enter the quiet garden and begin the ritual of raking, creating patterns in the white gravel that seemed to embody the very essence of flow, balance, and order. But the true teaching of the garden was not in creating perfect patterns, but in accepting completely that wind, rain, and time would inevitably disturb those patterns, requiring them to be made entirely fresh each day. The garden teaches us, Kenji would tell his students as they worked together in the early morning light, that attachment to specific outcomes always creates suffering, while complete dedication to the process creates deep peace. I cannot control whether tomorrow's storm will completely wash away today's patterns, but I can completely control the care, presence, and attention I bring to today's work. I cannot guarantee that visitors will understand the garden's message, but I can ensure that the message is clearly and purely expressed through my effort. This philosophy had shaped not just Kenji's gardening, but his entire approach to life. When the temple faced financial difficulties, he focused entirely on managing resources wisely in the present, rather than worrying about outcomes beyond his control. When regional political tensions threatened the sanctuary's peaceful existence, he concentrated on maintaining the inner peace that was his responsibility, while accepting that external events would unfold according to forces far larger than individual will. When students struggled with their practice, he offered guidance and support, while understanding deeply that each person's journey would proceed at its own unique pace and in its own way. But the deepest test of Kenji's philosophy would come through his relationship with his daughter Yuki, whose life would become the ultimate teaching about the absolute necessity of letting go. Yuki had been born during Kenji's early years, before he had fully committed to his life at the sanctuary. Her mother, a talented local potter whose ceramic work was prized throughout the region, had died when Yuki was only 3 years old, leaving Kenji to balance his calling with his profound responsibility as a father. Rather than abandon either role, he had created a beautiful arrangement. Yuki lived near the temple grounds with supportive relatives during the week, and spent weekends with her father, learning, alongside him, the art of finding peace within impermanence. As Yuki grew into adulthood, she displayed the same careful attention to beauty, presence, and detail that characterized her father's work, but applied it beautifully to the art of pottery that had been her mother's passion. By her 15th birthday, her ceramic bowls and vases were so exceptional that merchants from far away would travel to acquire them. Her work combined technical perfection with an emotional depth that seemed to capture something essential about the fleeting nature of beauty itself. Kenji felt immense pride in his daughter's achievements, but more than pride, he felt a deep satisfaction in seeing how she had completely absorbed the lessons he had tried to teach her about dedication to craft without attachment to results. "Watch how she works," he would tell his students as they observed Yuki shaping raw clay at her potter's wheel in the courtyard. "She gives complete, absolute attention to each piece while it's being created. But if it cracks in the hot kiln or breaks during glazing, she simply begins again with a smile, without a single moment of disappointment. She understands deeply that the true joy is in the making, never in the keeping. But as Yuki entered her 20th year, she began experiencing physical symptoms that would challenge everything both father and daughter believed about acceptance and letting go. What began as occasional fatigue and subtle weakness gradually progressed into something far more serious, a wasting illness that the medicine of the era could neither explain nor cure. The exact same hands that had created pottery of extraordinary beauty began to tremble too severely to shape clay. The vibrant energy that had allowed her to work for hours at her wheel diminished until she could barely manage simple daily tasks around their living quarters. Kenji's initial response demonstrated the profound depth of his practice. Instead of raging against the diagnosis, sinking into despair, or desperately searching for miraculous cures, he approached his daughter's illness the exact same way. He approached the daily disruption of his carefully raked garden patterns as another natural manifestation of life's impermanent nature that called for absolute acceptance rather than resistance. He arranged for the best available medical comfort while understanding deeply that the ultimate outcome was entirely beyond his control. He spent more quality time with Yuki, treasuring each conversation while accepting that their time together was limited. "Father," Yuki said during one of their slow walks through the temple grounds, her voice weak but her spirit still incredibly bright. "I understand now why you've always taught me about the importance of letting go. I can accept that my pottery-making days are ending, and I can even accept that my life might be much shorter than we hoped. But I'm struggling with one thing in my heart. If I let go completely, if I accept everything that's happening to my body, am I giving up? Am I abandoning hope?" Kenji paused beside a mature cherry tree whose pink blossoms were just beginning to fall in the breeze, each petal dropping gracefully when its time had come, creating a beautiful carpet of white and pink that would soon nourish the soil for next year's growth. "Watch the blossoms, Yuki," he said gently. "Do they fall because they've given up hope, or because they understand their perfect role in a larger, beautiful cycle? When they let go of the branch, are they dying, or are they participating in the continuation of life itself? The ancient ones taught that you only ever lose what you cling to desperately." In the falling blossoms, Kenji found the perfect metaphor for this profound truth. Letting go, Yuki, he explained to his daughter, is never the same as giving up. Giving up is refusing to participate in life because we can't control its outcomes. Letting go is participating fully, with complete love and dedication, while understanding deeply that we are part of something far larger than our individual will. Over the following months, as Yuki's physical condition gradually worsened, both father and daughter would learn lessons about surrender that went far deeper than anything Kenji had understood during his decades of garden maintenance. They discovered that letting go of control over outcomes actually increased their ability to influence the quality, love, and presence of each current moment. When Yuki completely stopped struggling against her body's limitations, she found unexpected energy for activities that were still possible, teaching pottery techniques to young students, even when she could no longer demonstrate them herself, creating beautiful poetry that captured her insights about impermanence, and spending quiet time with her father that was richer than any of their previous conversations. "I understand now, Father," Yuki told Kenji, as they sat together in the rock garden one evening, watching the last light fade from the carefully arranged stones. "Why you could spend 30 years raking patterns that would be completely disturbed the very next day. The peace isn't in having the patterns last forever. It's in being fully present while you're creating them. The true meaning isn't in controlling what happens to your work. It's in bringing complete love and attention to the work itself." When Yuki died the following spring, during the cherry blossom season that had become so symbolic of their conversations, Kenji faced the ultimate test of everything he had ever taught and practiced. The grief was completely overwhelming: the deep loss of his daughter, the ending of dreams about her future, the silence where her laughter used to be, and the empty space that would never be filled. For weeks after the funeral, Kenji found himself entirely unable to tend the rock garden. The simple act of raking gravel, which had been his daily meditation for 3 decades, felt physically and emotionally impossible in the face of such profound personal loss. He would enter the garden each morning with his wooden rake, but instead of working, he would simply sit among the stones and weep for everything that letting go had required him to release. It was during one of these difficult morning vigils that Kenji noticed something that would transform his understanding of surrender forever. The garden, completely untended for weeks, had not fallen into ugly chaos as his controlling mind might have expected. Instead, wind and rain had created their own beautiful patterns in the white gravel, not the careful geometric designs he usually maintained, but organic curves and natural flows that seemed to embody the very essence of natural process. Leaves had fallen beautifully among the stones, not as debris to be removed, but as reminders that even the most carefully controlled environments remain part of nature's larger, wiser rhythm. "She is still teaching me," Kenji said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty courtyard. He suddenly realized that Yuki's death, like the falling cherry blossoms, was not an absolute end but a profound transformation. Her beautiful influence on his life would continue in ways he could never control or predict, just as the garden's beauty persisted even when he was not actively maintaining it. When Kenji finally returned to his daily practice of raking, his approach had subtly but fundamentally changed. Instead of trying to impose rigid, forced patterns on the gravel, he began working in partnership with the natural formations that the weather had created, enhancing rather than replacing what was already there. Instead of viewing wind and rain as disruptions to be corrected, he saw them as natural collaborators in an ongoing work of art that was far larger than any single individual's vision. "I spent 30 years learning to let go of attachment to outcomes," he would tell visitors who came to meditate in the garden. "But it took losing my beloved daughter to understand that true letting go is never about cold detachment. It's about participating fully in something so much larger than ourselves that our individual control becomes completely irrelevant. The garden teaches patience, but life teaches absolute trust." This final understanding transformed not just Kenji's gardening, but his entire relationship with uncertainty, change, and life itself. He had learned that the deepest letting go is never passive resignation, but active, profound trust, faith that life has an intelligence and direction that individual effort can serve beautifully, but can never command. Like a river that accomplishes its journey to the sea, not by forcing its way through solid obstacles, but by finding the path of least resistance. Human life achieves its greatest purposes when we align our efforts with forces far larger than our personal will. In our modern world, this principle applies perfectly to every single area where we exhaust ourselves, trying to control outcomes that are fundamentally beyond our influence. In relationships, we can give our absolute best effort to love, support, and communication while accepting completely that we cannot control how others respond or how relationships evolve over time. In our careers, we can work diligently and skillfully while understanding that ultimate success depends on countless variables beyond our individual actions. In health, we can make wise choices about diet, rest, and care while accepting that aging, illness, and change are natural processes that unfold according to their own timing. The practice of letting go begins with distinguishing clearly between what we can and cannot control. We can control our effort, our attention, our choices, and our responses to circumstances in the present moment. We cannot control final outcomes, other people's decisions, natural events, or the timing of results. When we focus our energy entirely on what we can influence while accepting completely what we cannot, we discover a kind of profound effectiveness and peace that fighting against reality makes impossible. This never means becoming passive or abandoning your goals. Kenji continued tending his garden with the exact same care, love, and dedication he had always brought to the work. What changed completely was his relationship to the results. She found total satisfaction in the process itself, rather than needing specific outcomes to feel successful. This shift from anxious attachment to pure dedication, from controlling to participating, freed enormous amounts of energy for creativity, problem-solving, and genuine responsiveness to changing circumstances. The deepest teaching of letting go is that it opens us to beautiful possibilities we could never have planned or controlled. When we stop insisting that life conform to our limited vision of how things should unfold, we become available to opportunities and insights that our controlling minds would never have imagined. When we trust the process rather than demanding specific results, we often discover that life has plans for us that are far more interesting, meaningful, and fulfilling than anything we could have designed ourselves. Years after Yuki's death, Kenji established a pottery school adjacent to the temple grounds, where young students learned not just ceramic techniques, but the deeper art of creating beauty while accepting impermanence. The school became famous throughout the land, attracting artists who came to study what they called the way of surrender, the ability to work with complete dedication while remaining entirely unattached to results. Yuki's influence had continued in ways that neither she nor her father could have ever planned, demonstrating beautifully that letting go allows life to unfold according to an intelligence far greater than individual understanding. As you come to the end of this journey through 10 principles of unshakable wisdom, notice how every single teaching has pointed toward the exact same fundamental truth. Peace comes never from controlling life, but from learning to dance with it. The words that cannot hurt you, the difficult people who become your greatest teachers, the envy that transforms into inspiration, the perfect balance between self-discipline and compassion, the understanding that no one can hurt you without your permission, the power of acceptance, the wisdom of living according to nature, the foundation of ethical living, the transformative power of gratitude, and finally, the art of trusting the process. All of these practices prepare us for the ultimate letting go that makes genuine freedom possible. Tomorrow you'll face situations where you're tempted to force outcomes, to control what cannot be controlled, and to exhaust yourself fighting against circumstances that are already unfolding. In each of these moments, you can remember the rock garden and ask yourself, what would it look like to participate fully in this situation with love and dedication, while trusting the larger process of which it's a part? The 10th and final principle of becoming unshakable is this: trust the process and let go of control. Focus your energy entirely on what you can influence: your effort, attention, and responses in the present moment, while accepting completely what you cannot control. When you stop fighting against life's natural flow, you discover that you're part of an intelligence far greater than your individual will, and that this intelligence can accomplish through you what your controlling mind could never achieve alone. In this final letting go lies the secret of all the previous teachings. You become unshakable, not by building stronger defenses against life's uncertainties, but by learning to flow with those uncertainties so skillfully that they become allies rather than enemies, like cherry blossoms that fall when their time comes, participating in cycles of renewal that extend far beyond their individual existence. You can learn to live with such trust in life's process that even endings become beginnings, even losses become gifts, and even uncertainty becomes the very foundation of unshakable peace. Rest now in this final wisdom, dear soul. You are an integral part of something infinitely larger and more intelligent than your worries, your plans, or your need to control. Trust the process completely, and let that trust carry you into deep, restorative sleep as gently as blossoms falling into the welcoming earth below.